Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Helped Todoroki Face His Demons? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanf. Alright, everyone in their seats. Shudo found it slightly amusing how quickly everyone managed to get into their seats the second the command left Aizawa's mouth. Their teacher just sighed, walking out from behind his podium and towards Aoyama. Alright, I'm passing out a sheet with important information on it. This will be necessary for today's topic and the upcoming quiz, so don't lose it. He fixed a pointed glare at Kaminari, inciting a couple snickers from around the room. Shudo merely took the copy Tokoyami was handing him. How to recognize signs of child abuse. Shudo felt his blood run cold. This almost felt like a targeting, if Aizawa would do such a thing. Shudo forced himself to relax. If Aizawa suspected anything about his home life, he would have just said so. He wasn't the type to beat around the bush in such a backhanded way. He tried not to sink into his chair as the lecture commenced. Doing anything that resembled the behavior they were discussing in class would only incite suspicion. Shudo made sure to take a deep breath to keep his heart from stuttering. He could make it through this lecture, and hopefully most of the class would forget about the signs anyway. A child may be afraid to tell anyone about the abuse, especially if the abuser is a parent, other relative, or family friend. Aizawa was saying, glancing about the classroom. He didn't even stop on Shudo, though he still felt himself nearly jump out of his skin when he met Aizawa's eyes briefly. They might end up withdrawing inward if you try to pry any information out of them, so be cautious. Abuse is a serious issue. Shudo tried not to feel guilty about that statement. His situation really hadn't been that bad. He didn't need to be treated gently, no one needed to care about what was going on in his home life. Shudo was just overreacting is all. He wasn't even really abused, so to think that he was remotely related to this, even for a minute, was ridiculous. He shoved down the guilt building in his gut. There were definitely a lot of kids who had it worse than he did. He had no right to think he deserved the attention Aizawa was talking about. He hadn't been abused, just raised with a more aggressive parenting tactic. He was fine. Absolutely fine. Still, he couldn't help but feel the prickle of being watched, though whenever he surveyed the room no one was looking at him. You're just being paranoid. Shudo chastised himself. Stop overreacting. You have nothing to complain about. Shudo had to repeat this mantra of his lack of relation to this topic for the remainder of the lesson, almost letting himself sigh in relief as Aizawa dismissed the class before reminding himself that he had no reason to feel relieved at all. You were not abused. He snapped internally. Stop trying to seek attention for yourself and face it. There's nothing wrong with your home life. There's just something wrong with you that makes you try to relate yourself to that. It was disgusting how Shudo didn't really believe it when he told it to himself, but he remained steadfast to the thought process until he could recite it perfectly. He had no right to believe he'd been abused. He was almost certain that his classmates were watching him as they changed into their hero costumes later that day. He was worried someone would point out the bruises along his torso and was quickly formulating an excuse, though it was never brought up in the end. He almost had a full-on panic attack when Kirishima hit him in just the wrong place during their spar, inciting Shudo to whimper pitifully when his bruise was irritated. Shudo certainly didn't want to have to explain to Kirishima why he just made that wretched noise, and instead began a quick, somewhat sloppy counterattack. But it had the desired effect, distracting Kirishima well enough that he didn't bring it up even after class had ended. One thing's for sure. Shudo had been on edge since their lesson, and he didn't even know why. Now that he'd gone through his repetitive thought process enough times, he had convinced himself that his home condition truly wasn't that big of a deal, that it wasn't as concerning as he'd initially thought. If it had been abuse, then Shudo would exhibit more of the signs, right? Shudo was making his way up to his room when Midoriya stopped him. "Hey, Todoroki," he called. Shudo did his best not to flinch as Midoriya came to a stop in front of him. "What is it, Midoriya? Do you want to join us for movie night?" Midoriya asked, giving him a bright smile. "Today was pretty long, at least to me, So I thought we could all unwind so we don't wake up stressed tomorrow? Shudo mulled the thought over. Frankly, he felt as though he'd just barely made it through the day without giving anything away, though there was nothing to give away in the first place, so the thought of spending a couple more hours around the people he was hiding from might as well be his personal hell. Maybe another night, Midoriya? Shudo turned towards the stairwell, raising a placating hand towards his friend. I'm a bit tired, so I think I'll head to bed pretty soon. Midoriya nodded in understanding. Of course. You do what feels best. But if you change your mind, some of us will be down here. Shudo nodded in acknowledgement before beginning his climb up the stairs, practically holding his breath until he made it up to the 5th floor and into his dorm room. He didn't give himself a moment to breathe as he threw together a bag of clothes and toiletries for a shower downstairs. His anxiety would surely go down as soon as he got rid of these bruises from his last training session with Endeavor a couple days ago. A cold bath with some ice should clear them right up. He was glad to find that no one was in the bathroom when he began showering, so no one would feel the temperature drop when he formed some ice to use on the sore blotches. Because a couple of the bruises were on his left side, he felt the sting of the harsh ice on his skin and let out a hiss, once again thankful for the privacy he currently had. Once he'd finished washing himself up and icing the bruises as long as he dared, he stepped out of the shower and made to dress hastily. And he was almost done, when the bathroom door swung open, revealing Kirishima. Man, those are some nasty bruises, he remarked, swinging his towel over his shoulder as he made his way to the bench. No wonder you made that noise when we were sparring. I hope I didn't hurt you too badly. Shudo felt himself stiffen. Grit. This is exactly what I was hoping to avoid. Don't panic, there's nothing wrong with just a few simple bruises. They're easily explained. He just didn't want Kirishima blaming himself for them. Don't worry, Shudo began, pulling his shirt over his head before anything else could go wrong. They're not from you. Kirishima seemed to relax for a moment before frowning. Then, where did you get them? He cocked his head. I mean, it would make sense if they were from my hardening. But if they're not, how'd you get such nasty injuries? Shudo regrets everything. Why did he have to open his stupid mouth? Now Kirishima might suspect something, which would be completely unwarranted, as there was nothing to suspect. There was nothing wrong, and now Shudo might be giving off the wrong impression entirely. Training was all he trusted himself to say. What else could he say? That Endeavor gave him the bruises and various other injuries? That would give Kirishima the wrong assumption that there was something going on in his home life. His exit might have been a bit awkward and abrupt, but Shudo really felt the need to get out of there. Maybe he'd apologize to Kirishima later. He made a mental note to come up with a better excuse as to why he hurried out of there like that. It might be considered rude. After the day he'd had, Shudo didn't think he'd be able to actually get much sleep. Thinking about Endeavor for a whole day didn't exactly prepare one for an easy night's sleep. Instead, he conceded to getting ahead on his workload for classes. One thing his Endeavor had taught him without the use of his fists was to always do more than you should. Don't just succeed, excel. And so Shudo stayed up for the entire night, surviving off of his medication and juice. Honestly, he'd kill for an energy drink or coffee, but Endeavor had been strictly against letting anything like that anywhere near Shudo. He'd only been allowed juice and tea, but one of those was a bit more iffy for him nowadays. Although he was ultimately sure that he could still look perfectly presentable for class tomorrow. It wouldn't be his first time running on no sleep. It was their second day of going over the abuse handout. Aizawa had explained that there could be many forms of abuse, typically domestic, but they were mostly focusing on child abuse because that was the primary form of abuse that work-study students tended to get involved in through their agencies. Midoriya was thrilled to learn about how to spot it. This could save tons of kids like Eri who had to go through violence in their homes. He was more than willing to go through these extensive lectures to be able to bring as many kids to safety as possible. Even after the lecture had ended and they were well on their way to lunch, Midoriya found himself scanning those around him. Even though he knew it was kind of irrational, he couldn't stop himself from analyzing everyone. Although, he felt that maybe he was making some people uncomfortable. Todoroki seemed to have noticed Midoriya's excessive staring around the room, because he seemed to be keeping a stiff eye on Midoriya. So Midoriya tried to extend some courtesy to his friends and stop analyzing their every move. If someone as undeterrable as Todoroki found it a bit invasive, then that was probably a sign that it should be put away for later. Speaking of his friend, Todoroki didn't seem to say much during their break. While he was always a man of few words, he was never outright silent. Midoriya couldn't tell if he was just tired or if it was something else, but he'd already been invasive enough for today. So he tried to let it go. Midoriya was glad for the chatter in the locker room as they changed for hero training. It seemed that he wasn't the only one inadvertently observing people. As a matter of fact, most of his classmates had admitted to doing the same, save for a few like Todoroki and Kaken. Training kicked off without a hitch, Aizawa walking around as each student trained in their respective areas this time. He seemed pleased with what he saw, until he came up on Todoroki, whom, Midoriya had to admit, he was watching again. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sure, Todoroki definitely had seemed a bit more stiff than usual the past couple days. Midoriya wasn't sure exactly how long it had been going on for. But he didn't think he'd ever seen Todoroki outright jump upon being approached. "Oh, sir?" Todoroki gathered his bearings quickly, as if he hadn't just raised his right hand to eliminate the threat. The icy fog coming from Todoroki's hand fizzled out just as quickly as it had come alive, though Aizawa's eyes remained fixated on it. "Sorry, I didn't hear you approach." Aizawa frowned. "What was that, Todoroki? This is a relatively safe space, so I don't know what could have caused such a reaction." Midoriya tried to not make it obvious that he was no longer practicing his kicks. Thankfully, it seemed that Aizawa's attention was captured, and no one else had noticed the scene yet. "Sorry, sir." Todoroki bowed hastily. I don't really. I don't like being approached from my, Aizawa raised an expectant eyebrow. "So unrelenting as always. Go on." Todoroki sucked in a breath, seemingly forcing himself to square his shoulders and stand up straight. "I don't like being approached from my left side." His face remained unreadable, but his shoulders hunched ever so slightly. "It's a slight discomfort of mine." Aizawa seemed to put it together easily. Something had to have happened for that scar to get there, whatever kind of accident it was. Midoriya seemed to vaguely recall that his mother had spilled hot water on his face. It would explain why Todoroki was a bit wary of people approaching him from that side. Perhaps his peripheral vision had been damaged due to the injury, so he can't discern objects coming closer from that side? Midoriya's never thought about it before. Nonetheless, Aizawa seemed to understand enough, even though he didn't know anything about how Todoroki got that scar in the first place. He let it go, for now at least, telling Todoroki to get back to work. After fixing Midoriya with a scolding look, Aizawa walked away to survey the others. Midoriya felt a bit sheepish as Todoroki looked up at him. He must have seen the glare Aizawa sent his way. He didn't seem to like that he was being watched, but turned away nonetheless as he went back to training. Not wanting to invoke Aizawa's wrath, Midoriya quickly set his old pace in his training, kicking routinely as his mind wandered. Why had Midoriya been looking at him? Shudo was uncomfortable with every justification he laid out. He certainly didn't want to put Midoriya under the impression that there was something wrong. He shouldn't let Midoriya be needlessly worried like that. Shudo was certain that Kirishima was already watching him, though he could never catch him in the act. Perhaps after that incident, Shudo would have Aizawa watching him now too. It was just a little mistake he wanted to plead. Nothing to be worried about. It's just that Shudo's peripheral vision in his left eye was left a little damaged after the incident, so he can't see much coming up from that side. His vision being fuzzy out of the corner of his left eye was disconcerting, and frankly made it easier for him to panic. After he'd lost some sight, Endeavor's training had begun to be even harder, and it had only gotten him more stern yelling for being weak. It was fine. Everything was fine. As long as Shudo didn't dwell on the what-ifs and how they definitely didn't tie into anything personal, he'd be able to get through this without tipping anyone off that there was something wrong when there wasn't. He might have received a few more looks from his classmates when he refused yet another hangout session in the common area in the 1A dorms, but he really felt like he needed to be alone right now. After all, it was Friday, which meant that he'd be visiting Endeavor over the weekend for another training session. He needed to be well rested and mentally prepared. Because even though it wasn't abuse, it was still an incredibly taxing thing to go through, and he'd need every form of strength he could muster. Sure, he'd pretty much grown out of puking or passing out every time they trained, but there were still moments when he wished he could lay down and surrender without inciting another onslaught of attacks that would make him want to cry or die. But enough of that. Because it wasn't often as bad as he made it out to be. Shudo knew he'd be able to get through this one just as he did every visit. And sure, it might be a painful process, but it would have to end. Inevitably, it always did. And so Shudo set to taking an extra dose of melatonin to guarantee that he'd sleep tonight. Couldn't have him messing up in the middle of training due to an improper night's sleep. Midoriya loved every visit he got to spend with his mother. They'd both shed tears as they reunited at the bus stop. They'd walk together back to the apartment and cook dinner together, which they would then eat while playing an All Might movie in the background. All in all, Midoriya just loved spending the extra time with his mom now that he didn't get to see her all that often. So, as always, it was a tear-filled goodbye as he got back on the bus. Normally he would stay for the whole weekend and go back to the dorms Sunday afternoon. However, his mother would be having someone come to the apartment on Sunday to interview her for a better job than the one she had. Midoriya figured it would be an easier task to fulfill with him out of her hair, so he made his leave on Saturday evening. They could text all about it and talk in person next weekend. Midoriya knew that everyone else should be staying with their parents until sometime on Sunday. Some of them got back earlier than others, like Aoyama, who always greeted Midoriya at the door with a fresh cheese platter and a sparkling smile. To be fair, he did that for everyone when they returned, but Midoriya was one of the few who accepted it. Many of the rest made excuses, leading to Aoyama being under the impression that most of Class 1A is lactose intolerant. If Midoriya was correct, only Todoroki and Aoyama himself were lactose intolerant, though neither of them seemed to care much. And really, it just had to do with how hard their quirks were on their bodies and immune systems that caused them to be more susceptible to immunity issues, requiring more delicate and refined palates. Though that didn't stop Aoyama from practically inhaling cheese whenever the opportunity presented itself. Midoriya would have to formulate ideas on how exactly certain quirks affected the user's body later in his journal, once he finished his analysis of the logistics of how Kaminari could charge himself. He pushed the door to the dorms open, shocked to find that he was not as alone as he expected to be. My blocking has gotten better, definitely. But it's still too fragile to defend against his full-strength punch. Midoriya's eyes focused on Todoroki, sitting on one of the couches and apparently patching himself up from what looked like a street fight. Though his general posture indicated that he was in perfect condition, Todoroki had removed his shirt, revealing a sickening number of fresh, dark bruises all along his torso and arms. If Midoriya wasn't concerned by that, then he certainly was concerned as to why Todoroki seemed so good at cleaning himself up, wiping the blood and icing the bruises expertly, doing it absent-mindedly even as he seemed to be more preoccupied with talking to himself about what sounded like training strategies. But what type of rigorous training would cause this? And the wounds were certainly too fresh to have happened in class. He must have just gotten here from wherever the fight had happened. Had he met a villain on the way back from his house? No, he seemed too calm for that. Did he get into a fight or something? That didn't seem like something Todoroki would do. His train of thought came to a screeching halt when Todoroki turned his head to meet Midoriya's eyes. "You're muttering," Todoroki huffed, nearly a whisper. He seemed a little surprised at Midoriya's presence as well. "Sorry. If I had known you would be coming back so soon, I would have done this somewhere else." He moved towards his first aid kit, seemingly to pack everything away and move to a more secluded place, but Midoriya rushed forward before he could think about leaving, sitting himself on the couch beside Todoroki and reaching for his hand. He felt his heart wince when Todoroki flinched away from the contact. Midoriya immediately felt guilty. Why would he touch someone who so obviously had just been through a tremendous ordeal? And he dropped Todoroki's hand immediately. "Sorry." He moved to grab a disinfecting wipe from the kit and made a show of bringing it towards Todoroki, so that the latter could see what he was doing. He didn't want to freak Todoroki out with any unnecessary movements when he was so clearly jumpy from his altercation. "What are you doing?" Midoriya glanced up from cleaning one of the cuts on Todoroki's arm to see the bicolored eyes watching his movements carefully. Midoriya moved his eyes back down to watch what he was doing with his hands as he continued. "I'm helping you," he murmured as softly as he could manage. "You seem awfully beat up. Who hurt you?" Todoroki visibly stiffened, though Midoriya tried to pretend he hadn't noticed as he continued to clean the various cuts. They looked like wood scratches, as if he was thrown across a wooden floor repeatedly. "No one hurt me." Midoriya was about to open his mouth to refute, but Todoroki gently grabbed his hand and cut off his ministrations. Carefully, he set Midoriya's hand away and stood, grabbing his shirt. "I'm fine. Great actually. I'm getting better." Midoriya frowned. He didn't like where this conversation seemed to be going. "Getting better at what, Todoroki?" Midoriya stood too, trying to take a step forward but being met with the former merely taking a step away. "I just want to help you, and you're obviously hurt. What happened? Whoever did this to you, this is bad dash." "It's nothing, Midoriya," Todoroki said firmly. "There's nothing for you to worry about. I'm fine." It sounded over-rehearsed, as though he said that to himself in the mirror every morning in an effort to convince himself. Still, Midoriya didn't do anything as Todoroki gathered up the remainder of his things and took the elevator up. That simple action spoke volumes as to what he was hiding under the remainder of his clothes. Todoroki always took the stairs, never the elevator. He'd only do so if moving caused too much pain, like when Kaken accidentally, maybe on purpose, had blown half the skin on Todoroki's legs off a few weeks ago. Recovery Girl had been able to heal him, but he had still been in some serious pain for a couple days. And if this was anything like that, then Midoriya was worried. He was extremely worried. Why can't I do one thing right? Shudo hadn't self-harmed in what felt like forever. But it had probably been only a few weeks at most. He never cut. That would be too obvious, raise too much suspicion, and it was too much of a mess to properly tidy up quickly. Endeavor would have been furious had he done anything too obvious, and his anger never ended well. But bruises were easier to explain. To Endeavor, his classmates, anyone who noticed, having a few bruises was considered normal in the hero course. And if he needed to draw blood, he would scratch it out using his nails on his skin or by pulling his hair, always on the left side to ensure that no one else could see it. He figured that if it ever got bad enough that he desperately needed to cut, he'd use the box cutter in his desk drawer on the inside of his thighs. The forearms were too exposed, with his hero costume needing folded-up sleeves for his quirk to properly work. The forearms were too much of a risk. He hadn't felt the need to self-harm since Bakugo had singed most of his skin off. That pain, all the blood that had spilled, had been enough to carry him over for weeks. And usually, training with Endeavor satisfied the itch too. It was always painful, and more often than not it would draw some blood. The pain would last for days, and usually by then it was time for another training session. He was never without the feeling of pain, so it was rare that he felt the need to do it himself. It had already been done to him. But being caught in such an incriminating position by Midoriya, after days of assuring himself that no one would suspect anything, no one was watching, no one cared, Midoriya had to go along and disprove every last assurance to himself. Shudo had needed to get some control back, to keep himself from spiraling. He wouldn't be satisfied with a bruise this time. He used his quirk to form a little shard of ice, which he then pressed to one of the many small cuts on his other shoulder. It wouldn't widen or deepen the cut, but it would add some painful pressure to allow a bit more blood to flow from the wound. It took a few minutes, but after he had a couple of the cuts bleeding again, he felt in control enough to take the ice in his left hand and slowly heat it until his hand was just wet with water. He watched the blood spread for a few minutes, reveling in the sight of what proved he was a living thing before he sighed, following the routine of cleaning himself up. He rinsed the cuts off in the sink, grabbing the first aid kit again so that he could finish disinfecting them. Once that was done, he put on a couple bandages and all was done. He could ice the bruises in the morning. No one ever came back to the dorms early Sunday morning, so he would have enough time to take a quick shower. The only issue was Midoriya, and how Shudo would avoid having a conversation about what he'd seen. It wouldn't be easy to explain, I lie about, the injuries without incriminating himself. Well, incriminating Endeavor. but by extension himself. If he made it seem like his endeavor was a bit too physically harsh with him, that would just elicit sympathy and worry for him, which he did not deserve, nor was warranted. Midoriya was too caring for his own good for Shudo to not be wary of him. He chalked that night up to a failure, something he'd definitely have to work on in the future. He would have to remind himself that the dorms at UA were no longer a safe space, and that he needed to be more careful. That limited him to having only one particular safe space now, his room, but he'd manage with that. Before the dorms had been an option, he hadn't had any space he'd considered safe at all. He drew up his covers as soon as he got into bed, hoping that he could just sleep it off. But alas, it seemed that sleep wouldn't come easily to him tonight either. Shudo heard a knock at his door. There was only one person it could possibly be, so he felt a little bad about ignoring it. But Shudo knew he needed the alone time, so he held it out until he heard soft footsteps retreat back down the hallway. "I'm sorry, Midoriya. You weren't supposed to have seen that." Midoriya was a bit worried about Todoroki. Of course, he was usually worried about his friends, but this was different. Todoroki had been acting odd for a couple days, and now he's going around with massive injuries that he's just brushing off. He'd gone to check up on him but had received no response. Midoriya guessed it could be assumed that Todoroki was sleeping. It was decently late, after all, but still, something about it didn't sit right with him. Todoroki hadn't been so withdrawn from the rest of them since before he'd become their friend. And he'd given no explanation for those ugly bruises and cuts. If Midoriya didn't know any better, he might assume that Todoroki looked more sleep-deprived than usual. Midoriya knew he had sleeping issues sometimes, but never so bad as to be evident on his face. So yes, Midoriya was worried. And for good reason. But that didn't mean he could particularly do anything about it right now with Todoroki having gone to bed, seemingly avoiding him. He made his way back to the common room, sitting on the couch where he'd dropped off his stuff. He decided he might as well pull out some of his work to review before going to bed. After all, they would be on this topic for a couple more days, and then there'd be a quiz. Midoriya wanted to be prepared. At the very least, it should get his mind off of his worrying for a little while. The red flags of child abuse to look out for are withdrawal from friends or usual activities, depression, anxiety or unusual fears, or a sudden loss of self-confidence, sleep problems and nightmares, self-harm or attempts at suicide. Midoriya frowned at a couple of those. After being worried about Todoroki for a couple days, it was hard to not draw some correlations. He's been withdrawing a lot lately. And he does seem to be lacking some sleep. But I hope that last note doesn't apply. But why would it? Todoroki seemed to be a pretty straightforward guy. Midoriya didn't think he'd hide something he recognized as abuse. Physical abuse signs and symptoms, unexplained injuries, such as bruises, broken bones, fractures, or burns, injuries that don't match the given explanation, injuries that aren't compatible with the child's developmental ability. Midoriya frowned again. He didn't like the similarities with that either. But it couldn't be, right? Todoroki would never excuse abuse. The only reason Midoriya could give is that maybe Todoroki didn't see it as abuse. But still, he would have at least told him who gave him those injuries, right? Todoroki was always like that. He'd give Midoriya the big picture and skip the details. Midoriya would at least know what had happened, and Todoroki would leave him to piece together the situation by himself. It just didn't feel right. Todoroki could be dense sometimes, but he wasn't dumb. Midoriya was confident that Todoroki would know if he was being put through abuse, and he was more than capable of doing something about it. But there was still the question of whether any of this even applied to Todoroki. Todoroki had told Midoriya about the quirk marriage, and he could guess that his mother wasn't mentally healthy, given that Todoroki had mentioned that she lived in a psychiatric hospital. Midoriya knew that Todoroki resented his father for both of those facts, but even so, none of that was anything to go on in regards to possible abuse. That was just a rocky family situation, right? Midoriya decided to put his work away. He was obviously tired if his brain was trying to draw connections between Todoroki and what they were learning in class. It would probably seem silly to Midoriya eventually how wrong he'd been. And yet, he spent the rest of the night zoned out on the couch, trying not to think about how wrong it all felt. Shudo was glad he had gotten up early to take his shower. Just minutes after he'd finished, Aoyama had shown up and had somehow roped Shudo into fixing a cheese platter with him. "Has Midoriya been on the couch all night?" Aoyama muttered in that French accent of his. "An uncomfortable position, no?" Shudo glanced over the kitchen counter to see Midoriya's head on the couch, bent at an odd angle. He had probably fallen asleep doing work or something, as his bag was sitting beside the couch. "He must have fallen asleep while working last night," Shudo responded, returning to his task of arranging the cheese Aoyama was cutting. "The poor thing," Aoyama mused, humming as he slid another handful of cheese cubes to Shudo. "He must have been working quite hard to be able to fall asleep on those hard couches. Frankly, they're barely soft enough for me to sit on. I require a more plush cushioning for my delicate physique." Shudo listened numbly as Aoyama began to wax on about his sensitive skin and easily bruised bones, his mind more focused on the cheese at hand. Even as people started to arrive, and Aoyama moved on to handing out the cheese, Shudo wasn't very attentive to anything. Not even when their classmates began poking at Midoriya to wake him up. Shudo felt so out of it, in fact, that he completely missed Kirishima trying to get his attention until he was right in front of his face. "Hey, you alright, man?" Kirishima's question raised more than a few heads, though everyone pretended to be occupied with other things. Shudo didn't miss Midoriya's eyes, now trained on him intently. "You've been acting kind of strange for the last few days?" Shudo forced himself to look Kirishima in the eyes, trying not to cower when he saw genuine concern there. No, this wasn't right. Kirishima shouldn't be worried about him at all. Nothing was wrong, he was just having a rough couple days. The stress was probably getting to him, due to everyone watching him, even though he could never prove it, and the fact that they're going over a very serious and taxing topic in class. One which Shudo is trying to learn while also trying not to dwell on. He forced himself to nod, hoping the action didn't come off as awkward. "I'm alright. There's no need to worry. I'm sorry to have caused you any inconvenience." Kirishima didn't seem convinced, a frown in place of his usual smile on his normally bright face, but he let Shudo walk away, maybe a bit too hastily to be casual. "I'm sorry, Kirishima. But I need to get out of here. I need to get away. Get away. Until I can breathe again, just until I can breathe." Shudo forced himself to take the stairs so he wouldn't run into any more people, even though it was agony with the still fresh bruises. He made sure to take the steps 2 at a time until he reached his floor, heaving but refusing to stop. Even when Siro emerged from his room as he passed, Shudo ignored the way he had called out, rushing forward until the door shut and locked behind him. He felt his legs give out as he slid down the door, his breathing rushing so fast, and yet he felt like he couldn't get any air. He vaguely heard a knock, but he was too far gone to really think about it. "Can't breathe." The second Todoroki had left the room, conversation burst throughout the entire class, each spitting some nonsense theory which all boiled down to, there's something up with him. He's hiding something. Midoriya could tell they were all worried about him, so he didn't try to stop them from discussing the topic. Frankly, he felt a little bit better now that he knew he wasn't the only one to have noticed Todoroki's strange behavior. Maybe if more of them expressed their concern, they'd be able to help Todoroki with whatever was obviously bothering him. Why the hell should I care about Icy Hot's feelings? To no one's surprise, Kaken was glaring at Kirishima, who looked like he'd been trying to bring it up to him. "I'm just saying, man. You guys are friends, right? You took the preliminary classes with him. I was forced to. Still, you're not even a little worried about him? He's been acting off lately. Icy Hot knows how to handle himself." Kaken spat, crossing his arms. "He's always been blunt about what he needs or is thinking. Whatever is going on, it's probably just him stressing out for no reason, and that's why he can't explain it to the rest of you. Plus, he always acts weird. That's just how he is." Midoriya frowned. Kaken did have a point. Todoroki did have anxiety just like Midoriya did. But still, this felt different in a way. A way he couldn't quite put his finger on. Midoriya put the thought away as the door swung open, revealing Aizawa and ultimately cutting off any conversations still going on. No one wanted to get on his nerves by bringing possibly unnecessary worry to his attention. "Is everyone here?" Ida marched over stiffly, chopping his hands. Siro was the last to arrive. Everyone else besides him and Todoroki are all down here. Aizawa nodded. Then someone can fill them in later. Right now, I wanted to announce that we'll be having a couple of guest speakers tomorrow. He held up a hand to silence them as questions began to spring up. I'm not supposed to tell you, but I wanted to make sure you were all prepared to be on your best behavior. They're going to be helping with the lecture tomorrow, and I don't want anyone to do anything rude while highly ranked pros are here. Midoriya perked up. Highly ranked pros? Who's coming? Aizawa sighed, but now everyone's interest was piqued. Even Kaken seemed to attune to the conversation. Fine, Aizawa ran a hand over his face. Not like I wasn't going to tell you anyway. UA has arranged for Endeavor and Hawks to talk about some child abuse cases they've dealt with, so you know what it might be like off of paper. Midoriya perked up. The current top 2 pros? It would certainly make for an excellent class, to learn how actual pros go about helping abused kids rather than just reading about what to look for. It would almost certainly be different when actually on the field. Midoriya set his fists at his side. He was looking forward to it. Shudo wasn't sure when or how Shiro got into his room. He recalled locking the door before spiraling, but after a few minutes of having somewhat regained the ability to breathe just enough to stop the deafening sound of blood rushing in his ears, he was able to recall Shiro's voice coming from the other side of the door, telling him to breathe. Somewhere along the way, he must have convinced Shudo to unlock the door for him. Which was probably a good thing, seeing as he had been about to look for the nearest way to self-harm in order to regain some semblance of control. Although it was kind of humiliating, Shudo was glad Shiro was here. He hadn't touched Shudo without permission, he'd helped him gain control of his breathing, and now he was holding Shudo securely as he unceremoniously sobbed into his hoodie. Shudo couldn't even choke out an apology. Shiro would probably have to change, and he'd only just gotten back to the dorms. Shudo had seen him arrive, and he knew that Shiro had just changed into this outfit, which was nice and soft and Shudo could just get lost in it. He hoped he wasn't ruining it. Shudo tried to swallow the lump in his throat. Not going to tell anyone, right? He felt Shiro's soft chuckle through his chest, felt the huff of warm breath on his scalp. I'm not going to tell anyone anything that you don't want me to. Shudo nearly melted into the new feeling of a hand coming up to rub softly at his scalp. This is your business, not mine. Just say the word, and we'll keep this under lock and key, yeah? Shudo nodded into Shiro's chest, thankful that he had been the one up here. Sada was great, but he had not displayed the ability to calm people down like this. Maybe it was because Shiro was so chill most of the time, in a way Shudo never could be. But Shudo got the feeling that Shiro really knew what he was doing, way too good at this to not have prior experience. I'm sorry. He dug his fingers as tightly as he could into Shiro's. Sure to make his point. Sorry, I'm sorry. Shudo felt another soft chuckle come from Shiro. There's nothing to be sorry about, Roki. Something has hurt you, even if you refuse to see it, and I am not going to blame you for that. It's not your fault. I am here to help with whatever you need. Even if I don't know exactly what that is. Despite all the times All Might had said it, Shudo thinks that this might be his favorite declaration of I am here. Do you feel like talking about it? Shiro's voice came out soft. If not, that's totally okay. Shudo finally found the strength to pull away from Shiro, finally taking in that they were still on the floor of his room. I think so. His voice sounded horrible, hoarse and choked. The thickness of his throat was still there. Shiro didn't comment on it though, instead opting to help Shudo to his feet so they could sit more comfortably on his bed. There, Shudo felt safer, especially after Shiro wrapped his blanket around his shoulders. If you feel like stopping at any time, I won't judge. Shudo nodded. That was assuring to know. He took a deep breath, trying to decide what to even say. He didn't even really know what was wrong with him at this point. I've been kind of strung up lately. It has nothing to do with you guys or anything. He sighed, really not knowing how to phrase it right. I'm sorry. It's a little overwhelming when a lot of people are worrying about me when it doesn't feel like there's anything wrong. Shiro nodded. So, if you don't feel like anything's wrong, then what's got you strung up like you say? Shudo clenched his fists around his blanket for grounding. Endeavor has been occupying my mind a lot lately. As the #1 hero, he has high expectations for me. Always has. He shrugged in an attempt to belittle the comment. It's nothing in particular, just, the expectations of being his son are a lot to deal with, and when people take pity on me I feel like I'm failing at being what he wants. It wasn't a whole lie, but not the whole truth either. But Shudo didn't know how to tell the whole truth. He didn't even really know what the whole truth was right now. I just prefer to keep things to myself. It's easier to deal with when I don't have to worry about everyone else tracking my progress. He supposed he could leave it at that. So long as he got the point across, I don't like being worried about or having my tendencies analyzed, regardless of the intent of others. From how Shiro was nodding, it seemed like he understood well enough. Hey man, I get it. Shiro offered a smile. Sometimes all we need is some space. Privacy is important, and I don't know how easy it would be to keep everyone from worrying about you, but I'm sure they'd understand if you didn't want them butting into your business if it makes you uncomfortable. Shudo nodded. He was probably right in that the others would back off, and Shudo knew that the others wouldn't try to pry things from him, but, how to put it? If he admitted to them that anything was going on at all, he'd have to admit it to himself. He'd have to address that there is a problem there which he needs space and time to deal with. But it was easier to just go about thinking that there wasn't an issue. Because if there was, then Shudo might lose control of his mind and emotions, which are kept well checked. He doesn't want to dig up anything from where it's so neatly buried. They exchanged a few more words of comfort and confirmation before Shiro was on his way down, extending an offer for Shudo to come talk when he needed to. Nothing against Shiro, but Shudo felt like he'd talked enough for a lifetime. He was ready to go back to keeping it all shut in now. He was certain Shiro would be keeping an eye on him now, just like the others. Shudo didn't want to be wary of more of his classmates, but his resolve kept cracking and exposing him to more people. If anything, he just needed to get a handle on himself before it got out of control. Midoriya listened with intent as Endeavor spoke. The number one hero was talking about his first child abuse case back when he was in his 20s. The way he spoke about it made it seem like the tragedy of what that child went through still weighed on him. Midoriya supposed that these sorts of cases never left a person, no matter how much they grow afterwards. And Midoriya could believe that someone with kids of his own would definitely have a loathing of such situations. Speaking of his kids, Todoroki had seemed pretty shocked when his father had walked in with Hawks in tow. Midoriya was almost confused, but when he saw the same reaction from Shiro, he put it together that they'd forgotten to inform those two about the visitors coming. He inwardly grimaced, but there was nothing he could do about the forgotten promise now. After Endeavor spoke about a few occasions, Hawks took the podium with a few stories of his own, decently shocking a lot of the class when he admitted that he'd grown up in a similar situation. Midoriya noticed that Endeavor kept an eye on Todoroki in the back. He supposed it was normal for a parent to want to watch their kid, and for a hero to make sure that a student is paying attention to what is being discussed. Todoroki had mentioned before that his father had very high expectations of him, so Midoriya dismissed the idea as he was certain Endeavor wanted Todoroki to be listening to the lesson. Once the stories were done, Aizawa stepped up to encourage the class to ask questions before the two pros made their leave. As questions began to pop up, Midoriya tried to formulate a few of his own. As soon as the next question was finished being answered, Midoriya's hand shot up. Aizawa looked over at him lazily. Midoriya? Your question? Midoriya lowered his hand. I noticed that these stories were all about children under a certain age. I'm just wondering if there are any cases of teenagers suffering from abuse. That earned him a look from all three pros, but nonetheless Aizawa cleared his throat, apparently deciding to answer this one himself. Of course, there is abuse of all ages. Typically, abuse that starts in someone's teenage years will either cause a rebellion or the teenager informing someone. Midoriya frowned. But what about someone who's been abused since they were little? Is that different? Aizawa narrowed his eyes at him, but continued. Typically, a young child would have exhibited the signs early enough that it wouldn't go on for very long. If it were to carry into teenage years, it would have to be powered by psychological manipulation from the abuser. That way, the child would either not believe it to be abuse, or would think it is justified. Aizawa gripped the podium as he leaned slightly forward. In any case, the manipulation and abuse would have to be pretty powerful for a child to either fear or not consider coming forward, or to be able to hide the effects so well. Midoriya nodded, quickly grabbing his pencil to scratch down those notes. The sound of Aizawa clearing his throat recalled his attention once more. I know that I probably don't need to say this, but if you know someone who is undergoing abuse, in any sense, not just domestic, you should contact the proper services immediately. In a lot of cases such as these, people can end up dying or retaining permanent damage, physical or psychological. The class all nodded in understanding, and after a few more questions the lesson finished, everyone gathering up their things and heading to lunch. Midoriya knows. Shudo repeated this mantra in his head until it felt like his skull was bleeding. Yet he hadn't outright said anything. Did that mean he didn't care? Or was he just waiting to say something? What was Shudo going to do? How was he supposed to stop this? What could he do at this point? Midoriya obviously knew. Why else would he be asking those targeting questions? Right at Endeavor, no less? Midoriya had gone to great lengths to let Shudo know that he knew, even going so far as to use such a dirty, backhanded method to do so. It was almost sickening. And the whole class will know. Midoriya will tell everyone because he's worried, and Endeavor will kill him unless the inability to breathe did first. And Todoroki, where are you going? Shudo swung back around to where Midoriya was approaching, a leisurely smile on his face. Traitor, you sold me out. Now everyone knows and my days are numbered. Shudo mumbled eloquently. Nowhere. Midoriya cocked his head. You're not coming to lunch with us? Shudo immediately shook his head. No more people. Everyone's looking at me. At this. Right now. They see them. They see the bruises, don't they? Midoriya frowned, stepping closer by a hair. Shudo froze up immediately, flinching ever so slightly, causing Midoriya to falter. You are okay, right? His eyes softened. No, don't do that. You know we're here for you if you need dash. I have to go. I'm sorry, Midoriya. Shudo knew the abrupt exit was rude, he knew it was suspicious, but it was getting way too hard to keep his emotions in check. It was bad enough that Endeavor had shown up right after he'd admitted to Zero that he just needed to avoid being reminded of the man. It was bad enough that Zero was giving him worried looks during class. It was bad enough that Endeavor had talked about hitting a child like it was the worst sin in the world when he'd never shown that side to Shudo. And it was certainly bad enough that Shudo couldn't ignore it anymore. It came from Endeavor's own mouth, the different children he saved from abuse, situations so similar to Shudo's own, delivered by the hero's very hands. Even Endeavor saw those actions as abuse, so how was Shudo still denying it? Shudo! He froze, head snapping to the right, where Endeavor was standing in front of the wall. No, not now. Shudo looked around for anyone else, but they were alone. Shudo and his abuser? The words still felt foreign to him. I know how you were feeling in there, Shudo. Getting right to the point, huh? And you know that the way I teach you is completely different from something like that, right? Shudo went rigid. Did he know that? I treat you this way out of love. Endeavor said, arms crossing in a slightly menacing way. Because I want the best for you. Shudo gulped, forcing himself to nod. Why, yes, sir. Of course. Endeavor frowned still, gaze never wavering. You told that boy, didn't you? His glare hardened. The green one. Shudo's blood turned to ice, and he shook his head so hard it hurt. No. I didn't, I promise. He figured it out by himself. I didn't dash. Don't lie to my face, Shudo. His scowl was a death threat. After everything I've done for you, you still act this way? Petulant? If you can't keep your mouth shut, maybe I shouldn't be so gracious as to let you remain in a position where you have access to tell anyone. He didn't want to go back. UA was safe. At least, it had been until recently. I will let it go this time, since I am forgiving. Shudo nearly wilted in relief. He wanted to cry. But if you step out of line again, it will be the end of the line for this charade. Understood? Shudo nodded immediately. Understood, sir. Shudo waited for Endeavor to completely disappear from his sight before he broke. Tears streamed down his face as he bolted down the hallway. He ran all the way to the locker rooms where they would change for hero training later, slamming a stall door and covering his ears. No. I can't go back. What even is this anymore? Abuse? Petulance on my part? I'm overreacting, it's not this bad. Endeavor said so himself, it's because he loves me. But Shudo didn't feel loved. In fact, he wasn't sure he knew what it would feel like at all. What was it to be loved, if not to be beaten into the ground? To be separated from your siblings? To be forced to grow up strong in too many ways? To cover your ears at night and shield your body during the day? To have scalding tea poured on? What was it to be loved? Was there such a thing? There didn't seem to be, not for Shudo at least. He didn't know what any of this meant anymore. He just wanted it all to go away. That way he wouldn't have to know, wouldn't have to deal with it at all. It would just be gone. Why can't he do that? He wants so much to do that. Even through his hands covering his ears, he heard the door to the bathroom open, footsteps approaching his stall. Todoroki? Is that you? Shudo did his absolute best to keep from sobbing at Aizawa's voice. No, please. You were running pretty frantically in the halls. Is something wrong? Are you okay? Shudo refused to respond. He wouldn't. Every time he's opened his mouth in the last couple of days, he's screwed something up. Not again. He wouldn't. In class, Midoriya was talking about you, wasn't he? Before he knew what he was doing, Shudo had ripped open the stall door to refute, but no words would come out. Aizawa himself seemed taken aback by the response, and even more so at the state Shudo was in. His face softened in sympathy. I don't think he necessarily was thinking of you, but, Aizawa shrugged, movements careful, I think you subconsciously sparked him to ask that question, what with your recent behavior? I can see your classmates are worried about you. When Shudo made no movements, gave away no reaction, Aizawa stepped closer, stopping when he noticed the way Shudo froze. Whatever it is, you don't have to do this alone. Aizawa's gentle look was way too much right now. Is it Endeavor? You don't have to bury it, Todoroki. Aizawa attempted to reach his hands out for him, ever so slowly, though to Shudo it was the most violent movement in the world at the moment. If it's about Endeavor, we can help dash. Not even Shudo knew what was going on anymore. In one moment, the entire bathroom was layered in thick sheets of ice, including Aizawa, and Shudo made the quickest escape yet, all but scrambling through the door and down the hallways. He wasn't sure where he was running to yet. Before he knew it, he was in his room, grabbing everything he could to do it. A box cutter, the prescription bottle full of his anxiety medication, his water bottle. He only collapsed once he'd taken the stairs to the roof exit, falling down at the edge. No, I can't. Not anymore. Please, oh. I'm sorry. I promise, I'm sorry. Just let this work. Please. He scrambled to open the pill bottle with trembling hands, downing handful after handful with his water. He dropped a couple, but they weren't necessary. He grabbed the box cutter, completely uncaring as he gouged at the flesh of his arms. Finally, he was starting to feel good. For the first time in a long time. The slits cleared up everything, while a pleasant hazy feeling began to bloom in the back of his mind, probably from all the pills that would be taking effect soon. He dropped the box cutter and ripped off his jacket and shoes. I'm sorry everyone, please, let this work. Was overcome with all the clarity he could ever have from the cuts, and at the same time the glorious haze of ecstasy coming from the pills. He stepped up onto the roof's ledge, legs a bit wobbly but determined. Finally, whatever happens, he should end up dying. Whether from the gashes, the overdose, or the fall, something would inevitably kill him today. And he was content with that. He was eager. So much so that it was honestly scary. He wanted it so bad, to forget all the anxiety he's been choking on, all the confusion he's been drowning in. He just wants it to end so badly. He let gravity take him, succumbing to the heavy pull, the weight of his body betraying him, but a strong lurching in his gut sent him falling the wrong way. His back hit the roof's floor and his eyes shot open. And there he was. Aizawa, a wide-eyed look matching a perfectly horrified expression, gripping the capture weapon that was holding Shudo back with white fists. Hawks landed nearby. For a moment of sheer panic, Shudo thought Endeavor would come into view too, but he never did. The two pros seemed to piece together every piece of the puzzle fairly easily. The deep lines on his wrist, the bottle lying empty beside a few scattered pills, where they had found him. Todoroki. Aizawa removed his capture weapon from around Shudo and rushed over, beginning to press it hastily to the wounds on his arms to stop the blood flow. How many pills did you take? Shudo blinked. At the mere mention of the pills, he was suddenly aware of the growing haze at the back of his mind. He wanted to sleep. Todoroki. Aizawa shook him by the shoulders. Hawks appeared to be on the phone with someone a few feet away. Please, not Endeavor. Anyone else? You have to stay awake for me, okay? Aizawa's face was back in its authoritative, firm look, but his eyes betrayed his panic. He was afraid. Afraid of what? Losing Shudo? Couldn't be. Sorry, Shudo gasped out. He didn't want his teacher to be worried. Sorry. We'll talk later, Todoroki. His teacher huffed out hurriedly, gripping his shoulders fiercely. God, I hope not. How many pills did you take? Why were words so hard to form now? It felt like he had cotton in his mouth as he tried. Holding. Though it was getting harder to recall, he thought he remembered it being mostly full this morning when he'd skipped his dose. Probably shouldn't have done that. Aizawa spat a vulgar curse. Just hang in there, Todoroki. We'll get you to a hospital. Hawks, what's the situation with the ambulance? It's on its way. I called Recovery Girl too, but she said her quirk wouldn't help with something like this. Hawks said, walking over and pulling Shudo's body into his arms. I'll fly him down there to meet the ambulance. Aizawa nodded. I'll take the stairs. Shudo felt gravity leave his body, not in the way he would have liked, as Hawks flew him down to the front gate. I'm dashed, he choked on his own breath, which was beginning to stutter unevenly. I'm sorry. Shit. Hawks huffed into Shudo's hair. Why didn't you say anything? What's going on? It occurred to Shudo in his last moments of lucidity that Hawks didn't know. Why didn't he know? Doesn't everyone know? Didn't Midoriya tell everyone? That's why Aizawa came to find him, right? Maybe they don't know. Please, kid, you gotta stay with me. Hawks bounced his arms a little bit to shake Shudo awake as they landed. If you don't want to answer the question, fine. But you gotta talk to me. You can't go to sleep yet? Shudo hummed, his head leaning against Hawks' shoulder. It certainly felt comfortable here. And once he'd mentioned sleep, Shudo became acutely aware of how tired he was. How his eyelids drooped with exhaustion. Keep him awake, Hawks. Aizawa called, apparently having finally made it to the ground floor, running towards them at the gate. Get him talking. Come on, kiddo. There's gotta be something. Hawks continued to anxiously bounce him in his arms as he huffed impatiently. Do you want your father? Would that help? Hawks immediately faltered when Shudo convulsed, the panic in his chest swelling until he thought it would burst. He tried to push himself away from Hawks, but the strength in his body was gone. Whoa, kiddo. You're not going anywhere. I've got you. Hawks tightened his grip on Shudo, his voice dropping to a mumble. Why doesn't he want us to get his dad? Nearby, Aizawa huffed. He must have just arrived. I'll explain my theory later. I haven't quite gotten verbal confirmation yet. Shudo felt Aizawa move to stand in front of Hawks, putting a gentle hand on Shudo's shoulder as he was still struggling weakly in Hawks' hold. You've got to relax, Todoroki. His voice was soft. Once the ambulance gets here, you'll get help. I promise. Just hold on. Shudo didn't want to hold on. He wanted to let go, but he didn't know how. His body was struggling to keep itself alive when he didn't even want it to. I want to sleep. Just as the sound of sirens began to approach, Shudo was hit with an even sharper convulsion, curling into Hawks' chest before he could think. Dying sure was a trip, at least this part of it wouldn't last much longer. He vaguely thought he heard someone calling out to him, maybe more than one, but he could no longer make sense of any of the noise. He was still in someone's arms, who was attempting to shake him. His eyes must have closed, he thought, as another wave of pain caused him to curl in on himself further. People were shouting now, shouting nonsense, and suddenly he was no longer warm. His body was now stretched out on something cold. He was too flat. And something was keeping his wrists and ankles down so he couldn't convulse into a ball. It felt a million times more painful like this, but he felt someone's warm hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I with us to stand to my VO? But Shudo was lost by then. Midoriya was starting to feel really uneasy, worry spiking in his chest. Upon arrival at the locker room to change, they found it covered in ice. Midoriya thought that maybe someone had scared Todoroki, but he was nowhere to be found. And what's worse, Present Mike was stepping in for Aizawa with no explanation given. And had those been sirens outside the school before class started? Midoriya could have sworn he heard them on his way from the lunchroom, but he didn't know for sure. Midoriya didn't seem to be the only one distracted. The unease was evident throughout most of the class. Even Kaken seemed to be a bit more on edge than usual. Midoriya was only more confused when Hawks came in to exchange some quiet words with Mike. As far as he knew, Endeavor and Hawks were supposed to be gone by now, and Midoriya hadn't seen Endeavor around since lunch, so why was Hawks still here? Mike nodded solemnly at whatever Hawks had told him. They exchanged a few more words, and then Mike left the room. Midoriya felt it necessary to see what was going on. Hawks, sir? He tried not to shy away from the pro's attention. Where did Mike go? He tried to ignore the fact that the sounds of training had stopped behind him entirely. Hawks was looking over Midoriya's head, seemingly aware of that fact as well, but apparently opting to let it go. He has some news to deliver to your other teachers, Hawks said, crossing his arms. He asked me to oversee the rest of your training period to make sure nothing happens while he is gone. Kaminari found his way over, taking a stand beside Midoriya. Where is Mr. Aizawa? He asked, frowning. A couple more students were now wandering over, no longer trying to keep up the charade of training. Does this have something to do with him? Ida came up on Midoriya's other side, for once not chopping his hands enthusiastically. Does this have something to do with Todoroki? The boy's bathroom was covered in ice, and he's nowhere to be found. And now Aizawa and Mike are gone. Momo's voice came up from behind Midoriya, sounding solemn. This is a lot to take in, but we're worried. Is he okay? Was there a villain attack? Is that why you haven't left yet? Is that Icy Hot's blood on your shirt? Midoriya didn't know what shocked him more. That Kaken's voice was quiet, or that he didn't sound angry but more jaded? Midoriya thought that was the right word to describe the protective demeanor of his words. Midoriya's eyes trained on Hawk's shirt and, sure enough, there was blood. Not too much, but definitely something that hadn't been there that morning. Midoriya felt his stomach clenching uncomfortably at the thought of that blood belonging to Todoroki. Seriously, what happened? Did his old man pull something or what? For once, nobody told Kaken to stop being rude. If anything, his questions encouraged his classmates to ask their own, all bombarding Hawks with their festering worries. Hawks took the onslaught of panic with patience, waiting until the last of them had lost the energy they were using in order to continue their assault. Look, I can't tell you everything. He held up his hands placatingly as he began to be bombarded with more questions. All I can say is that there was a slight emergency. It's being taken care of, but the rest of it is confidential. You'll know when the school faculty tells you. Midoriya frowned at that. Emergency? What kind of emergency? Todoroki slipped in the bathroom kind of emergency, or Todoroki got jumped by a villain who broke into the school kind of emergency. Either way, Midoriya didn't like how secretive the whole thing was. If it had been a villain, they would have said something, evacuated the school perhaps. And if it had been something as simple as him slipping, they all would have been told to be careful in there from now on. They wouldn't be kept in the dark about it. Something about this wasn't adding up. They were trying to hide something. An uneasy feeling came over Midoriya as he could feel several pieces clicking into place at once. He'd always been good at quick thinking, but he still didn't have the full picture. Can you at least tell us if Todoroki's okay? Midoriya wanted to know, of course, and this might also give him some clue of what happened, regardless of the answer. Hawk sighed. I can't say for sure, but hopefully he's getting the help he needs right now. It clicked, the sirens. He knew there'd been sirens on his way out of the lunchroom. Todoroki, for some reason or another, had been taken to the hospital, probably by an ambulance. And again, if they wouldn't say anything about it, it would have to be serious, but not a public threat. But the only thing Midoriya could think of that would warrant privacy, an ambulance, and a serious tone would be. But no. Midoriya absolutely refused to think that Todoroki would do such a thing. He wouldn't. Of course he wouldn't. Why would? But again, Midoriya was always good at connecting the pieces at the right time. The last few days, the behavior towards his father, the withdrawal, anxiety, aversion to proximity and touch, it all seemed to make such twisted sense. Todoroki's behavior had started the day their lesson on child abuse had begun. Ever since then he'd been on edge, wary of being around or talking to others more than he had to. He'd put it together before how it resembled a lot of the red flags they'd been learning about in class. Midoriya also knew that Todoroki resented his father, and now that everything was lining up, Hawks seemed to be able to tell the exact moment Midoriya put everything together, opening his mouth to say something appeasing just as Midoriya clamped his hand over his mouth, to keep from crying or vomiting. He wasn't sure. Todoroki had tried to, "Hey, let's all calm down." Midoriya refocused his attention on Hawks to ground himself. Several of his classmates were looking at Midoriya now. They could probably tell he had formed some sort of answer and were wanting to be let in on it, but Hawks quickly regathered the attention of the class. "Let's not speculate about what we don't know." Hawks made to look at each one of them, opting to ignore Kaken's even if you know in favor of resuming his speech. "We should grant everyone their privacy, and it will all come to light in due time. Until then, I'd say this class is done for the day." Midoriya frowned, though he wasn't really in it mentally anymore. "But we still have half an hour?" Hawks cast him a knowing look. "You all look tired, so I think you've done enough. You shouldn't overwork yourselves. Just go home and get some rest." Although no one seemed to like it, everyone agreed, grumbling as they made their way to change. Although, judging by the looks Midoriya was receiving, they weren't going to let him stay quiet for long. He just hoped, prayed, that he was wrong. Aizawa hadn't been able to stop crying since he'd gotten off the phone with Hisashi. In fact, he didn't think he'd ever cried this much in his entire hero career. Not since Oboro had passed. He thought that after that he'd be done with crying. He didn't stop crying when All Might and Nizu showed up, but by the time a nurse approached them he was all out of tears. He still felt like his insides were wrenching themselves apart whenever he thought about it. That was the worst thing he had ever seen. More than any case he's ever worked, any villain he's ever fought, any injury he's ever sustained. One of his kid, had tried to commit suicide, and had possibly succeeded, because he didn't know how to sort through whatever has been going on in his life. Aizawa still didn't fully know what it was about, but his best guess was horrifying and probably correct. One of his kids had been hurting for who even knows how long, and Aizawa had failed to see it until it was almost too late. There was a chance it was too late. Aizawa could barely lift his head from his fist to look up at the nurse. She gave him a gentle smile, but it did nothing to help at this point. Nizu ended up speaking first. "How is he?" Aizawa was glad he'd had the sense to have Hawks inform Nizu. He certainly needed someone with more composure to handle the situation right now. "The doctors have gotten him stable." "Well, that was good at least. There's no telling if he'll get worse or better right now. They're stitching up the open wounds, and if he doesn't throw anything up soon then we'll probably be sending him into surgery." She turned to Aizawa. Great. You said he told you he took the whole bottle?" Aizawa nodded, exhaustion evident in the movement. "I checked the pill bottle on my way to the gate. The prescription was just recently refilled, and the whole thing was empty. But I'm assuming that downing even half that bottle would be lethal if it stays in his system." The nurse hummed, attention moving back to Nizu. "That's a relief. Shall we inform his parents?" Aizawa's head immediately shot up, fully prepared to protest, but Nizu held up a small, placating hand. "There's no need. His father signed a form that gives you a partial guardianship over him. Since this happened on our campus, we can take care of it for now. We'll let his parents know ourselves once he's ready for it." Aizawa felt himself wilt in relief. All Might fixed him with a strange look, but he couldn't care less right now. Because the one thing he knew, Todoroki had never freaked out the way Aizawa saw him absolutely convulse at the mere mention of his father. Not counting when he'd booked it from the bathroom earlier upon being confronted with that name. Whatever Todoroki was going through, Aizawa had a pretty good idea, was related to Endeavor. And Endeavor was going to suffer for it, if Aizawa had anything to say about it. He'd give himself a say if he had to. Anything to protect his kid. He let himself slouch back in the chair, praying to anyone he could think of that his kid would turn out okay. "You're late." Dabi was never impressed with Hawks. Now that the hero was becoming more assimilated into the League of Villains, he seemed to get more lax with their meetups, as if they were no big deal anymore. But whenever Dabi tried to complain to Tamura, he usually just got cussed at and thrown out of whatever room the wrinkly shit had holed himself up in. But this time, there was no witty quip to his snide remark. Matter of fact, Hawks looked more exhausted than Tamura on a usual day, which is saying something. "Oh, what happened to you?" Toga's cheery voice filled the room as she kicked her legs under the table she sat on. "You look worse than Tamura-kun." Dabi snorted. "I was thinking the same thing." "Hey!" Tamura's scratchy voice carried over from the couch across the room where he was fiddling with a Nintendo something other. "I can hear you." "We know. Go die." "Not without you." "Go to hell." "See you there." Tamura threw one of the couch cushions at Dabi, who merely flipped him off in return as the pillow thudded innocently a few feet away. "Wow, you really can't aim," Dabi mused as he refocused his attention on Hawks, who was now sitting unceremoniously on one of the nice couches, courtesy of the Lubrication Army or whatever they call themselves now, Liberation? Screw it. Not important. If all went to plan, Dabi would be burning with endeavor before it really mattered anyway, so there was no use in learning the new alias. "Believe me, I would have been here sooner, but we had an issue at you." Dabi raised an eyebrow. "What situation? What could go so wrong that the school would have to call you of all people?" He expected a glare, but Hawks merely sighed, running a hand over his face. "I was speaking to a class there with Endeavor today." Dabi scowled at the mention of the flaming trash heap, but Hawks didn't even stop to admire his work. "Anyways, I had to help get one of the students to the hospital quickly, and ended up standing in for Aizawa to watch the rest of his class." Toga gasped, leaning so far forward that Dabi was honestly waiting for the small end table to tilt and cause a massive spill. "Was it Izuku-kun?" Hawks shook his head. "Endeavor's kid." Dabi's body went rigid against his better judgment. He was never supposed to care about the kid, but he couldn't help it. What had happened to Shudo? Just as soon as Dabi had thought it, Toga had asked it, which earned them a nonplussed look from Hawks. "What?" She whined, kicking her feet faster. "It's not like we're going to let this secret out. Who would we tell that would listen to us?" Hawks seemed to debate for a moment, before his shoulders slumped. Maybe it was a heavy enough topic that he needed to get it off his chest. Though that thought didn't sit well with Dabi one bit. "We were discussing child abuse to the class today. And oh, Dabi felt like he knew where this was going now. Shudo seemed to be disturbed by this. We haven't gotten the full story yet, but something set him off and he tried to jump." Dabi's blood ran cold, and several other league members pretending they weren't paying attention stilled as they turned towards him. Even Tamura seemed shocked, even displeased, at this, looking up from his game. "Jump? As in kill himself?" Tamura asked, scratching at his neck again. "Are you sure that's what it was?" "Please don't answer that," Dabi felt himself urging. "Please, I don't want that clarification. There's no way Shudo." "Not just jump." Hawks slouched further into the couch, closing his eyes. "Eraser and I found him with freshly slit wrists too. Apparently, before we'd gotten there, he'd downed an entire bottle of pills as well. Kid was trying everything. We got him in the ambulance, but..." Hawks' sigh was ignorant agony. "I haven't heard anything since." Finally, Dabi thought he knew what cold felt like again. Ever since his entire body had burned that night, the coolest temperature he'd been able to feel was a dull heat underneath his skin, as if it were trapped there. But now his very blood was ice, his bones feeling as dense and cold as stone. He suddenly very much wished he could sit down. Tamura spared him a glance. He was the only member of the league whom Dabi had trusted to confide in about his past, but he knew to say nothing as he stood. "This is Endeavor's fault, correct?" Hawks sighed, running a hand over his face. "It hasn't exactly been confirmed, but, yeah. It looks to be that way." Tamura nodded, humming as he moved to stand in the center of the room. "I think the current #1 hero has just made the top of our hit list." Dabi couldn't agree more with that statement. He wanted to melt the man's face off and make the world watch as he spouted every horrible thing he'd ever done to his children. His whole family, really. But at the same time, Dabi didn't feel like he could move at all. Shudo, his sweet, innocent Shudo, who had still loved his big brother Tuya even after he'd expressed hatred for his younger brother, who still loved Mom even after she'd poured boiling water on his face, who still loved their other siblings even though he was never allowed near them, who wanted to be a hero so bad so that he could save others from people like their father. His Shudo had tried, and had maybe even succeeded, to kill himself. And Dabi could feel nothing. At the same time as he felt way too much of everything. It was impossible to explain, and too hard for Dabi to care to make sense of at the moment. His Shudo, small, soft little Shudo, forced to become jaded and cold by their father. Forced to continue undergoing the intensive training abuse, alone once Mom and Tuya had left for good, still being forced to stay away from his remaining siblings because his father wouldn't let them tarnish his masterpiece. His Shudo had finally broken. All of the fracture lines he'd been made of had now been fully pushed through and scattered. And Shudo had shattered thinking he was all alone, that his only option was to eliminate all other options for the future. He truly thought of death as something worthy enough to even graze a fingernail over Tuya's once precious little Shudo. Dabi would protect what Tuya had loved, though he hadn't been able to see that he did love him until after he had died. Dabi would wrangle Endeavor and make the man's ashes into fertilizer for the garden he would plant for Mom and Shudo, to mourn what father had done to them. And for Fuyumi and Natsuo, to mourn what father had never done for them. Hawks seemed to want to protest. Dabi wanted to punch him for that, but he merely dropped his head on the back of the couch, not uttering a word. Dabi supposed that there could be things he appreciated about Hawks, like knowing when to finally shut his mouth, for example. The League of Villains didn't care about hero students or helping people. What they did care about was a child being put through some form of abuse and feeling like no one will come to save them. The League knew what it was like to have that happen to them, to feel like that, and they were not ones to let things like this slide. Shudo was not going to become the next Dabi, not the next Toga, and pray to God not the next Tamura or anyone else. If Dabi had anything to say about it, Shudo would be the first Shudo before he became the next anybody else. He was going to take his little Shudo back by making Endeavor suffer for every last one of his sins. Midoriya kind of wished he had kept his mouth shut once they had all made it back to the dorms. He'd been cornered and begged to share what his guess was, and even after trying to assure them that it was just a hunch that might even be a bit far-fetched, no one would drop it. They all believed in Midoriya's assumption, even more so than he himself did at this point. No one could be consoled anymore. Even after Vlad King had come to check on them in the place of Aizawa, and he had tried to lighten the mood as he always did, he was not able to breach the wall of devastation that now blanketed 1A. So far, Midoriya had seen Aoyama give up halfway through cutting some cheese and end up walking away. He had seen Mina lacking any enthusiasm as she flipped mindlessly through TV channels, and not a single soul, not even Kaminari himself, laughed or poked fun when Kaminari tripped over an electrical cord. He really wished he'd kept his theory to himself. But he ultimately knew that was asking too much. The rest of his classmates deserved to know how he'd put the evidence together, and maybe to their relief he'd be proven wrong and they'd all shove him around for scaring them like that. How he prayed for that. Midoriya and his classmates pretended to not hear Momo's sniffling during whatever movie they had ended up watching. They pretended they didn't notice the way Kaken didn't yell at the TV once, either for the movie selection or the stupidity of the characters. They pretended to think nothing of how Siro had to excuse himself to go upstairs halfway through the movie. They pretended not to see the way his expression was crumbling, obviously close to crying. They pretended that they weren't bothered by the empty seat at the end of the couch beside Midoriya, usually occupied by Todoroki, who would be curled up into a ball, probably asleep by now as he never used to have movie nights. They pretended the atmosphere didn't feel empty with the lack of deadpanned and straightforward comments throughout the film asking why, what, how. They pretended it wasn't weird that Todoroki was gone. They pretended that it was nothing to be concerned about at all. He was just in his room or something. As the movie went off, the atmosphere turned more fragile, the air like glass as everyone was too afraid to be the first to speak. Well, came Mina's wobbly voice. She tried to fix the group with a smile as she clenched the remote in a death grip. Did you guys like the movie? Her voice broke, and that was it for Midoriya. Fresh tears and loud sobs were impossible to stop. And as soon as he lost it, Uraraka and Momo lost it too. He thought maybe Hagakure was crying, but it was hard to tell. Aoyama might have actually been the one crying the hardest at the moment, mascara running. The ones who were keeping themselves together long enough to make it to their rooms straightened up the area as well as they could. Bowls set in the sink, blankets folded haphazardly, the TV turned off. Midoriya and the others started to regain some composure as the others started to head up to their room. Once on his floor, he noticed that Aoyama was standing outside Tokoyami's door. He gave Midoriya a weak smile. "Good night." He attempted a sad wave before putting the hand in front of his mouth, probably to stop another sob. Midoriya waved him good night as Tokoyami's door opened and Aoyama was let in without question. And Midoriya wouldn't question it either. Aoyama and Tokoyami often stayed with each other when things were rough. Midoriya sank right onto his bed, having it occur to him that he had not changed into his pajamas. Only now, he didn't have the energy to get back up. At least he wasn't in his school uniform anymore. It took him too long to fall asleep. The sweet release of death shouldn't sound like an alarm clock beeping in a steady, quiet rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Shudo was nowhere near lucid, but he knew enough to tell that he was still very much alive, if the painful convulsing and fuzzy head were anything to go by. He wanted to cry. Beep, 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 beep. Why couldn't he just succeed at one simple thing? Seriously? How hard is it to die? He had laid out 3 different ways to do it and still failed? Beep 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 beep. But why? Beep beba beba beep. Omething's Ron, heart monitor, hook him up to dash. What's going on? Shudo thought that he might have recognized that voice if he were a bit more lucid. Who was it? Sarhead, please stay back, need to stabilize high. No, please, just let me go. Beep beba beep. I don't want to be here, please. I want to go. Someone, get him hooked up. We need to go into immediate surgery. Just let me die, please. Yelling. A lot of yelling, all of it incoherent as it fell on deaf ears. Shudo thought he might actually finally be slipping away. Just please, please. Hawks gripped the armrests of his uncomfortable plastic hospital chair, already missing the plush cushions of the League's couches. He'd never heard Aizawa sound so frantic before when he picked up the phone. The League members were enjoying pitching ideas for how they should eliminate Endeavor as soon and as gruesomely as possible when he'd gotten the call. He would have thought Aizawa would be asleep by now, as it was well past midnight. When he answered, the League went silent as even they could hear how panicked the pros sounded over the line. Todoroki Shudo had almost died just after 2 in the morning. Up until then, he had been in and out, not lucid enough to be considered awake, but no longer exclusively unconscious. He had dry heaved a few times in those sparse minutes, but ultimately nothing had happened. They'd called for an immediate surgery when he'd suddenly woken up, breathing so little and yet heaving too harshly as his body tried to forcibly eject all the downed pills to no avail. Apparently, the violent spasming was enough to freak out even Aizawa. Hawks had shown up right in the middle of it all. Nizu had taken him to where they were sitting, and they'd stumbled into all might having to restrain Aizawa from trying to re-enter the room. Hawks had been able to see through the small window how horribly things were going in the room. The orders barked harshly to everyone in there could be heard all throughout the hallway. They were losing him. The surgery had quieted down after a while, going more smoothly now that Todoroki seemed to be stabilized once again. Though for how long, they didn't know for sure. Hawks was sending updates to the League every couple of minutes. They had threatened to come there and find out for themselves what was happening if he didn't otherwise. The last thing Hawks needed was to have the League of Villains show up in front of Todoroki's surgery room, give Aizawa any more anxiety, and have to explain how the League knew and why they were there. At least Aizawa was checking for updates every couple of minutes so that Hawks didn't have to. He just texted the League whatever Aizawa mumbled each time he sat back down. Hawks had snuck a glance at Aizawa's phone to see what he was up to, noticing a text he'd sent to present Mike. Todoroki's not doing so well. I may need you to take over my class tomorrow. Hawks figured as much. Aizawa couldn't have gotten a wink of sleep, not even while Hawks had been gone. He'd ridden in the ambulance and stayed in the hospital the whole time with Todoroki while Hawks had made a quick check-in with the League. He hadn't been planning on going after all that had happened, but once he'd realized that the alternative would be sitting in the hospital while Todoroki possibly died in the next room was too much to handle. Hawks had chosen to take a quick breather with a couple of genocidal psychopaths. To be honest, Hawks didn't know why he'd come back. He had rushed over, telling himself it was just to keep the League from coming instead, but really he just wanted to know the kid was alright. He worked with his father, and he needed to know that something Endeavor had done hadn't killed his son. He had to know that Todoroki would survive. He had to be there to know. Nizu had made tea, to varying degrees of thankfulness. All Might had finished his before it had cooled down. He'd always been one to need to do something with his hands and have his stomach settled during upsetting times. Aizawa had barely touched his, and it was no longer steaming. Hawks had only been sipping on it mindlessly in order to have a simple action to perform as they waited. It was cold by now, but that didn't stop him from continuing to sip at it. He shot another text to Shigaraki. Eraser doesn't think the kid's doing so hot. No word from the doctors. He didn't get a text back, but he saw that it had been read almost immediately. Hawks internally rolled his eyes. The League wouldn't admit that they were worried, but it was evident to anyone who observed their behavior. They didn't want Todoroki to die as much as Hawks and the others didn't. They weren't absolute monsters after all. They'd told him as much after he'd started getting to know them a bit more. They all came from varying levels of abuse. Even if Hawks didn't know all of their backstories, he knew they sympathized with a kid who had gone through something similar to what they had. And so Hawks waited. He'd been sitting in that chair for hours and he'd probably sit there for a couple more. But he was alright with that so long as the kid made it. If Todoroki made it through the hours, Hawks could too. When Mike took to the podium, heaving a heavy sigh, it felt like all of Midoriya's worries had been proven correct. Aizawa would never miss a day of class, even if he had only just been in the hospital a few hours prior to the start of class. Todoroki wasn't there. Midoriya knew that at some point after the class had gotten back to the dorms the previous day, everyone had gone up to see if Todoroki was in his room at least once. He never was, no matter who had gone or when. The people who were a little more adventurous went so far as to open the door to look inside the room only to get the same result. Todoroki was not in the dorms. He had not been in Recovery Girl's office when Midoriya checked after class. He had not been visiting with any teachers. Midoriya knew very well that Recovery Girl could heal almost any injury. But something such as, say, swallowing a bunch of pills? Losing too much blood and having no remaining stamina? She couldn't operate on things like that, which only furthered Midoriya's assumption as to what had happened to Todoroki. Not only that, but Midoriya and a couple others had seen All Might and Nizu leave the campus after school hours had officially ended. Aizawa had not returned, but Mike had been seemingly communicating with him over text. Now, Midoriya pretty much knew for certain what had happened to Todoroki, why Aizawa wasn't in class, and what exactly was going on. Endeavor. Midoriya tried not to let his expression sour at the fleeting thought of that name as Mike began going over the day's lesson plan, only to be interrupted when Kirishima raised a hand. Mike looked like he wanted to pretend he hadn't seen it, but who couldn't see Kirishima's stock-still arm raised in urgency? Kirishima? You have a question? Mike had never sounded so tired before. Kirishima bit his lip, hand falling to fiddle in his lap. About Todoroki? Mike held up a slow hand. Another odd sign. Mike almost never displayed unenthusiastic movements. I know you're all wondering about that, Mike sighed, looking around to see now attentive students. And believe me, you all will probably be the first to know. But unfortunately it's confidential right now. Mike shrugged, shaking his head at the mumbles of protest throughout the room. I can't say anything. I reckon when Shoyuta gets back, he'll tell you. Kirishima didn't look satisfied with that answer, none of them did, but no more questions were raised about Todoroki or Aizawa's absence. Mike continued with the lessons as normal. Midoriya was past the test for their lessons on child abuse. He blinked again, mentally noting all the similarities on the test to Todoroki against his will. He really didn't want to think about this, and after he'd told the others yesterday, it seemed that they didn't like the test much either. Not even Momo, who was usually so confident, borderline excited when it came to taking tests. It seemed that things were almost normal, save for the empty seat, absent teacher and vague tension throughout the room, when Kaken suddenly slammed a hand on his paper and stood up in rage. Midoriya couldn't see his face, but he could tell by his tone that he was livid. "Are we seriously going to ignore this?" he screamed, grabbing the offending sheet of paper off his desk and waving it in the air, glare directed at Mike. "We all know what's really up with Icy Hot. We all know what happened and why." He fixed his glare over their classmates next. "Are we seriously going to ignore that we all know how similar half and half is to this stupid test?" Midoriya bit his tongue to keep from crying again. He needed to hold it together, and Kaken wasn't helping in that regard. In fact, Midoriya was pretty sure he saw several of their classmates turn their heads or hide their faces in their hands. "K. Kaken, please." Midoriya's eyes found their way back to Mike, who looked stunned. Maybe he hadn't expected the class to put it together so quickly, but then again he didn't know this class as well as Aizawa did. "Let me get this straight." Mike stood up to his full height, still staring at Kaken. "You know about this?" "How? We all know about it." Kaken scoffed. "Damn nerd figured it out yesterday." Mick's eyes wandered to Midoriya, who tried not to sink in his chair. He blinked harshly several times to keep the tears at bay. Mick's eyes softened, glancing around the class. "What do you all think happened yesterday?" Kaken all but snarled. "We know Icy Hot tried to, not even he wanted to say it, die. And we know it's Endeavor's fault." "We don't know that for sure." Mike sighed, but Kaken was having none of it, storming up with his test in hand and shoving it at the teacher. "Take one look at this and tell me you don't immediately know what's going on." Kaken stormed back to his desk and angrily sat down as Mike clutched the paper, admittedly not looking at it. "We all know." Mike didn't say anything for a long time, and when he finally did it was devoid of anything that would give away what he was thinking. "Everyone turn in your tests, please." He set Kaken's paper down on the podium. "You will be having your hero training with ectoplasm today." So no All Might. That was to be expected, Midoriya supposed. He had seen him leave, and he hadn't seen him around the campus since. Still, as they left the room, Midoriya noticed Mike tapping away at his phone. "Thanks for telling me. I'll call you back later." Aizawa sighed as he hung up the phone, turning towards the others. "Hisashi says that my class has figured out what's going on." He ran a hand over his face. "They're all impulsive and currently anxious. I don't know what they'll do, but I think someone should tell them formally." Nizu nodded in understanding. "I'll arrange for that to happen. I should return to UA before anything should go wrong. In the meantime, you three should think about getting some rest." He glanced at each of the pros slumped around him. "As far as I know, none of you have gotten a wink of sleep since you've been here." "I'm not going to leave," Aizawa grumbled, shaking his head. "Not until I know the kid's all right." Hawks and All Might were quick to agree with him, and Nizu just sighed as if he'd expected that response. "Very well," he conceded, folding his hands behind his back. "But I doubt you'll be able to provide any comfort or counsel to the boy if you're too bone-tired to keep your own heads up." He said it in that tone that made Aizawa know he was right, but it was so obnoxious that it frustrated him even more. Because it really should be obvious that they wouldn't be able to do anything once Todoroki had actually woken up. The three of them watched Nizu walk away before looking at each other. "I suppose he's right." All Might shrugged at last. "Maybe we could switch off trying to sleep in these chairs until we get a report?" Hawks and Aizawa shared a look before nodding. That seemed decent enough, since it was obvious none of them were planning on leaving, but they'd be too tired to help otherwise. Aizawa took the first shift of waiting while the other two got to sleep in their chairs. He figured he would need a little bit of time before he could fall asleep anyway, so he might as well extend them some courtesy. After all, those two didn't have to be here. This was Aizawa's kid, who'd done this on his watch. Hawks and All Might were concerned about the kid. Aizawa was too, of course, but he also felt guilty for not having seen this coming when it had started. How long had his kid been hurting? To what degree? Or for the life of him, if Aizawa didn't get any confirmation about what Endeavor had potentially put his student through, he was going to string that man up and force it out of him himself. Class 1A was more than distressed when Principal Nizu came in Wednesday morning to talk to them. He informed them that indeed, Todoroki had tried to commit suicide after Monday's lecture. He wouldn't tell them anything else, saying that they were still investigating, ignoring comments thrown from people like Kaken that basically relayed what they all knew about why he had done it. But at least Nizu had taken pity on them and assured them that when he had last been at the hospital, Todoroki had been resting after his surgery. From what Nizu told them, it seemed like he would pull through. So Midoriya and the rest of the class at least had some relief from the situation now. The class's lecture before lunch had been cancelled in favor of Nizu having arranged an assembly for the entire school to talk about mental health and such, encouraging people to come forward with either their own issues or worries about other students. He didn't expressly call out Class 1A, but they knew explicitly why the assembly had been called. Once the students had been released to go to lunch, Midoriya heard a bunch of murmurs from other students about the lecture. Several weren't actually very far off, claiming that maybe something had happened on or around UA's campus that caused the school to address the issue. Others were making crude jokes about the seminar, poking fun at what had been said. Kirishima and Shiro had to physically restrain Kaken from those students. No one wanted to give it away that someone in 1A was dealing with that. They all wanted to respect Todoroki's privacy. As such, it was necessary to keep Kaken from launching or screaming at anyone else, and that involved Shiro taping his mouth shut, as well as his arms and legs to his seat. People gave them weird looks, but it was normal for Kaken to have certain outbursts, so ultimately nothing came of that at least. If anyone from other years or classes noticed Todoroki's absence, no one mentioned anything. Maybe some had, but decided to keep Todoroki's privacy in mind as well. If that was the case, then Midoriya was thankful. Midoriya tried to keep his head up. After all, the reality of what Todoroki had done might have been upsetting, but he was going to get better now, right? The hospital staff was helping him, and soon he'd be getting the kind of help he really needs. Or so Midoriya hoped. If there was one student Aizawa had not been expecting to see showing up at the hospital, it was Amajiki Tamaki. Aizawa had been ready for any of Class 1A to barge in and demand to see Todoroki, to know all the details of what had happened. Aizawa was on his second surveillance shift now, just having switched with Hawks. He was feeling better after resting for a bit, but still didn't feel all that great. He gave Tamaki a confused look when the student sat down in the open chair beside him, setting a bag on the floor in between them. Tamaki, he murmured in greeting, trying to be considerate of the others sleeping on his other side. What are you doing here? We had a suicide prevention assembly at school today, the other mumbled quietly, shrugging his shoulders. I noticed your absence, and one of your students was gone too. And Nizu visited your classroom this morning. All of your students look pretty down, even Kirishima. So I put it together that... He glanced at the door down the hall, and Aizawa had to mentally slap himself. Tamaki may not be the kind to brag openly about himself, but back when Aizawa was his teacher he had seen for himself how smart the kid was. He should have seen this coming from at least one student. How did you know where to go? He asked hoarsely. Tamaki had probably gone to Nizu to get the information about the hospital and room number. What Aizawa couldn't wrap his head around was why Nizu would give Tamaki the information. His former student sighed, reaching into the bag he'd brought and handing Aizawa a water bottle. Although Aizawa still wanted the full story, he accepted it in favor of clearing his throat. Nizu told me, Tamaki muttered once Aizawa had started to drink. I didn't want to intrude on you, but I told him that I wanted to bring you and the other pros that might be here some things to help. Aizawa raised an eyebrow as he put the cap back on his bottle. To help Todoroki? Tamaki hunched his shoulders a little, an indication that there was more to this than he let on. There are some things that might help him. He nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. But waiting outside the hospital room can be really hard on people, so I thought I'd bring you some things to help with that too. Tamaki started tapping his fingers and pulling at his sleeves, tipping Aizawa off that Tamaki might still not be sharing the whole truth. And you know this how? He didn't miss the way Tamaki's movements stuttered. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate this, and I'm sure Hawks and All Might will too. I'm just concerned that there's something you're not telling me, and you're the type to bottle things up and never share. So is there something you want to tell me, but you're not sure how? Tamaki opened his mouth, closed it again, before setting his jaw and nodding. Back in my last year of middle school, I tried to jump. Well, that certainly stunned Aizawa. He would have thought he knew everything about his old students, that they couldn't surprise him anymore. But clearly he'd been wrong. I had cut myself up a lot too, he continued, fiddling with his sleeves. I was hoping that something would do it, but, well, Mirio found me and convinced me not to jump. He waited at the hospital for days until I was conscious again after a couple blood transfusions. Tamaki began folding and unfolding his hands repeatedly, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do under his old teacher's gaze. But Aizawa didn't really know how to make it any easier. Why did so many kids hide things like this? Aizawa didn't think he'd ever truly understand again what being a kid is like. Still, the fact that these were kids going through things like this? Aizawa kind of wanted to be sick at the thought. I was kind of upset that Mirio had stopped me, he mumbled, biting at his lip. But when I saw how frazzled he looked after being allowed in the room, I felt really bad. He shrugged, looking a little guilty. He had done so much to take care of me and help me, but there was no one to help him out there. All he could do was sit in the hallway and pray I'd be okay because no one would tell him anything and I was too ashamed to see him for a while. It was hard on both of us. Aizawa tilted his head. Do you ever regret it? Tamaki blinked, still avoiding looking at Aizawa, though he supposed he couldn't blame him for that. I'm not sure that I can, or want to, regret wanting to die. He shrugged, tugging at his sleeves again. It's not something I'll ever blame myself for. And I don't really think I regret trying to either. Aizawa was about to open his mouth, but his eyes caught on the tightening of Tamaki's fists on his shirt, and looked back at his student's face. I think I needed to be that close to dying to realize how small it all was in comparison. Tamaki spread his fingers out, trying to raise his eyes until he was looking at Aizawa's shirt, not daring to go any further. When I was dying, I wasn't really thinking about what I loathed at all. I was thinking about everything else. All the things I still loved. In the face of death, the issues didn't seem to matter. At that point, it was a choice of what I wanted more, release or a second chance. Tamaki removed his eyes from Aizawa just as they were creeping up towards his face, instead opting to grab the bag and haul it into his lap, shuffling through it. Anyway, I brought some things I thought might help you be a bit more comfortable as you sat here. It's pretty stressful to have to go through something like this for someone else, and, I thought you could use some of this. Aizawa exhaled heavily as he noticed Tamaki trying to direct the conversation away from him now. But Aizawa would let him. This was obviously a sensitive topic to those who went through it, and it would be a pretty shitty move to try to pry now. Aizawa was actually glad his student had shown up. He'd thought ahead and had brought some pretty useful things, for the teachers and Todoroki. He must have visited Hizashi as well, because he had Aizawa's forgotten wallet so that he could get some snacks when hungry. Tamaki had actually seemed pretty sheepish when he pulled out the last item in the bag, what seemed to be a deformed stuffed animal with no clear indication of what it was supposed to be. Aizawa sent him a quizzical look, and Tamaki sank into his shoulders. Mirio got me something similar back then. He shrugged, though how that was possible when his neck was pretty much a part of his shoulders, Aizawa wasn't sure. It was the first thing that really made me laugh afterwards, so I thought maybe your student could use something like it. Aizawa almost thought he could laugh too. The thing was its own kind of hideous. He was sure anyone would laugh under normal circumstances. He made sure to shoot Tamaki a grateful smile. I'm sure I speak for all of us, Todoroki included, when I say that I'm really glad you ended up coming, and thankful for what you brought. Tamaki's face colored in the way it usually did whenever he was put on the spot unexpectedly, avoiding eye contact. It's, no big deal really. He looked down at his lap. I just wanted to return the favor. I know I would have felt a bit better if I had known that Mirio wasn't suffering the whole time he was waiting for me. It might help your student to know that you weren't just sitting in uncomfortable chairs with nothing to eat or drink the whole time you waited. Aizawa nodded. I'm glad to have your insight. Would you want me to tell him about this for you? I'm sure he'd appreciate it. Tamaki's face went from pink to red. Aizawa could almost see steam coming from his ears. Oh no, that's okay. He laughed nervously, pulling at his hair a bit. You don't need to tell him it's from me or anything. I don't need that kind of acknowledgement. It'll be all I need knowing it's helped a little. Aizawa nodded. He'd expected Tamaki to say that. He'd never been about acknowledgement or appreciation. He did things just to do them. And if he truly thought it would help Todoroki to know that his teachers weren't put through discomfort in order to get him help, then Aizawa would trust that. Especially coming from someone who'd gone through something similar. By the time All Might and Hawks started stirring, Tamaki was gone. He hadn't wanted to stay too long, and being confronted by the other two heroes, former number 1 and current number 2, probably wasn't on his bucket list. All Might and Hawks had both told Aizawa off for not waking one of them up to take over his shift, but he'd admitted that he felt loads better and didn't feel tired enough to go back to sleep. He told them one of his old students had dropped by to give them a few things, and after he got them looking through the bag they were no longer that interested in chewing him out. He was thankful for the conversation they'd had. It had him feeling a lot better about how to handle things when Todoroki woke up. "Look, I don't know, okay?" Hawks whispered harshly into the phone. "We haven't been allowed in. Doctors say he's still out cold. All I can tell you is that he's in recovery, and seems to be doing better." Hawks almost wished the League would go back to mostly ignoring him. He was always trying to get them to talk to him more, to possibly give him more information, but right now he just wanted to put his phone on silent. He lowered his voice even more, though he was a few meters out of anyone else's earshot. "Look, you can't be calling me in the middle of a hospital. What if someone heard your voice? I can't have my cover blown dash." Yeah. Shigaraki muttered, obviously disregarding what he'd just said. "We get it. You don't want to be seen with us." "Whatever." Hawk scowled. "I just don't want to be arrested right in the middle of dash." "Well, I mean you are a spy for the League, so dash." Dabi's amused voice really had Hawks wishing he'd outright decline the call. Instead, he pinched the bridge of his nose and sighed deeply. "Why can't you guys just be stingy with your calls like normal people instead of calling me on speaker every single time? It's chaos." "Ha!" Toga practically screeched into the receiver. "We're better at sharing than heroes." "How funny." "Shut up, Toga." Dabi snarled, and it sounded like something got thrown, probably at Dabi, judging by the grunt he made. He cursed at her, and then they both seemed to run off, Dabi shouting obscenities as she giggled. He heard a long sigh. "Idiots." Right now, Hawks thought he might be able to agree with Shigaraki. "Just dashed." Hawks spit back another sigh. "Just don't call me when you know I'm in public, yeah? Anyways, I've got to go. So I'll dash. Don't even think about calling me back." Shigaraki snapped. "I don't want to hear your gross-ass voice over the phone more than I have to." Hawk scowled. "Right back at you, fingers. Stop calling me dash. Anyways, bye." He made sure to hang up before Shigaraki began threatening to dust his face off. That was per the usual for them, occurring at least once in every single one of their interactions. He pocketed his phone and strode back to his seat, where he'd left his can of coffee to take the call. That had almost been a disaster, as Aizawa had been sitting right next to him. Luckily, Hawks refused to have a person's actual name as their contact like a normal person. So when he received a call from Krusty Cuticles, Aizawa merely raised an eyebrow at him. He took a swig from his can, but the once cold coffee was now lukewarm, which made him shudder. Aizawa didn't acknowledge him as he sat back down, picking through several items in the bag his former student had given him. Hawks found it odd that Aizawa wouldn't tell them which student it had been, but he wasn't going to question it now. He was just thankful for the things the student had brought. He was about to make a comment to Aizawa about the weird deformed stuffed animal he was handling when the door to Todoroki's room opened. All at once, the three pros stood up, staring at the doctor who exited. He looked up, apparently not shocked at the eagerness of the pros. Instead, he nodded, gesturing to the door. "He's awake." Shuto and the pro heroes in the room remained at a standstill, neither daring to speak first. Shuto kept his eyes trained straight ahead at the wall, pretending that the fresh cuts on his arms weren't on full display. Even on what should have been his deathbed, Todoroki Shuto was the perfect depiction of apathy. His face betrayed nothing, even when it had been so clear to these people earlier how much was wrong. Imagine Shuto's devastation when he'd woken up. He could excuse the moments when his head would clear just enough to hear voices, or feel the convulsions going on in his stomach. He figured that after a few of those he'd be free from anything else. He had not even allowed himself to entertain the idea that he would open his eyes and still be here. Awake. In recovery. Alive. He hadn't even wanted to think about it, And now here he was, eyes open, awake, recovering, alive. This wasn't fair. None of this was fair. Why didn't he get to die? Why did he have to survive? Why did they have to save him? He had been so ready, and now? And now what? What were they going to do to him? Send him back to Endeavor? That would just be another death sentence. At this point Shudo was prepared for that. Or maybe they'd send him. They wouldn't. They couldn't do that to him. They might choose to send him to a psychiatric ward until he was deemed cured of his mental illness, fully recovered as if he'd just fought off a disease. He was not sick. He would not go to a mental hospital. He could not end up like her, stuck in a psychiatric hospital with no way out other than to open up to others about all the trauma that was too painful to even think about. Shudo wouldn't do it. He would not allow himself to suffer that same fate as she had. He would make sure he died before he ever got stuck in one of those prisons. Todoroki. Shudo became aware that he had zoned out, had been ignoring them. If he listened, he could hear that his heart monitor was speeding up, but they hadn't seemed to notice that yet, all intently focused on Shudo, who was intently focused on anything other than them. You've been going through a hard time, that much is clear, Aizawa began, coming to sit down in the chair beside his bed. Shudo pointedly did not look at him, did not indicate that he would make any response. He would not give them anything else to use against him. He would not be sent to a prison like her. He had done nothing wrong. This he would stand by. He was acutely aware of the pounding in his head, almost as painful as his throat, which felt as if it was on fire, and the rest of his body, as if he'd been put through a meat grinder and miraculously, dreadfully, survived. Still, regardless of all the different types of pain he was in, sharp or dull, prominent or sporadic, he gave nothing away. He made sure he did not wince, nor did he allow himself to flinch when Aizawa unexpectedly scooted his chair closer to his bedside in order to regain Shudo's attention. He did not give Aizawa the satisfaction of having it, eyes remaining intently focused on the wall, as if it was so much more interesting than the tense, painfully blatant elephant in the room. The nurse said you should be able to talk now, Aizawa muttered, letting out an unsatisfied hum. She said your throat would be in pain, but it would be manageable for you to speak. Why won't you, Todoroki? Shudo bit down on his tongue, not hard enough for his teacher to see his jaw clench, but hard enough to solidify his resolve to himself. Say nothing. Anything is everything in this situation. He might as well be handing them an open file about everything to do with him if he was to open his mouth. So he steadfastly refused. Aizawa sighed, and Shudo thought he might have vaguely been able to see his teacher run a hand over his face. Is this about Endeavor? Shudo involuntarily bristled ever so slightly at that name. It might have gone unnoticed, but the heart monitor he was attached to detailed the sudden spike in his heart rate. Traitor. The pros glanced at the heart monitor, but only Aizawa moved to say anything more about it. He's been hurting you, hasn't he? Shudo bit his tongue, refusing to lose face. No, not like this. Endeavor would not be exposed like this, with his pathetic excuse of a son in a hospital bed marred with self-inflicted wounds. It would not end like this. Still, he couldn't stop the monitor from picking up every jab of fear he felt, every jolt of his heart. He wasn't even opening his mouth and the pros were already getting what they wanted out of him. Stupid. Stupid, stupid. Look, we can't help you if we don't know the extent of what's going on. The door to the room opened, which saved Shudo from the pros hearing the third spike in his adrenaline as All Might went to see who it was. Todoroki? All Might turned back to the others in the room, smiling sheepishly. Your siblings are here. No noise could have overshadowed the sheer violence that his heartbeat became over the monitor. He couldn't even stop his fists from clenching into the bed sheets as his body began to tremble. Todoroki, he vaguely heard Aizawa call to him. Do you want to see them? Shudo thought about it. Of course, he didn't want them to see him like this. He would have to own up to doing this to himself, and they would only blame themselves for not seeing it sooner. But who could blame them? It had only been a couple months since they'd truly started to get to know Shudo. If anything, this was Endeavor's fault. But Endeavor is changing, right? He's not isolating Shudo anymore, and he's only trying to help him become a stronger hero. He started changing after the Nomu attack, and he is making an effort with his family. He cared now. Just because things were still a little rough for Shudo didn't mean that it wasn't better. The training didn't need to change because it had never been a problem in the first place. Training is just that, training. If it's a little rough, or too much to handle, that's on Shudo, not Endeavor. It's Shudo that needs to change now, not Endeavor. But a small part of him betrayed those feelings. Are we really back to this again? But Shudo refused to acknowledge those thoughts. Because he had never gone from that, not really. He had just been confused back then. Endeavor was changing, and the training had never been abused to begin with. It was time for Shudo to acknowledge his weakness and move on to be stronger, like Endeavor wanted. They're asking to see you, Todoroki. Shudo forced himself to stop trembling. This was fine. Everything was fine. Truthfully, he wanted to see his siblings. And if that happened to push off the interrogation for a little while and allow Shudo to gather his bearings, then that was all the more reason to see them. Slowly he nodded. Aizawa nodded as well, standing up and herding the other pros out of the room. Within a few minutes, the door was opening again. Shigaraki stared at the pathetic message on his phone. He was the only one left staring at it, as everyone else, who had previously been breathing down his neck and leaning over his shoulders for any sort of update, had all only been frustrated with the message and had promptly stormed off. Shigaraki knew why Dabi was upset. The former Todoroki had insisted that he'd left any feelings he might have had for his family behind. But Shigaraki had seen the look of horror that had come over Dabi's face when Hawks had first told them. He knew that look. It was the look of someone whose loved one was dying. The emptiness that Dabi's face had become was also familiar. Although Dabi's expressionless face was a practiced facade, Shigaraki had never been one to hide what he was feeling. If his emotions bothered someone good, they could all fuck off. Shigaraki wasn't confused about everyone else's frustration either. The text had been cryptic, and they could only assume they wouldn't be hearing from Hawks for a while. He's awake. Thanks, dipshit. But what does that mean? Was he recovering? Barely lucid? In and out of consciousness? Did that mean that he was getting better, or is the only development that he's awake? Shigaraki found himself wishing for the millionth time that Kurojairi was here. He would know what to do, how to act. He would handle everyone's raging emotions. He always knew how to calm Shigaraki down. He hadn't even realized that he was scratching at his neck at this point. He almost never really noticed anymore. It was just a habit he couldn't break. Still, it felt good to satisfy something, some sort of urge. He knew he couldn't go to the hospital in person, so the next best thing was tearing his own skin open. He felt one of his fingers catch on the flaky skin, and the next thing he knew his finger was wet with something warm and vaguely sticky. Still, he couldn't stop. The itch hadn't been satisfied. Then suddenly someone's hands were grabbing his own from behind. He looked above him to see Dabi's upside-down face looking back at him. Wordlessly, he put Shigaraki's hands down on the couch and walked around to the front of the couch. He sat down next to him and held out his palm. Shigaraki scowled, but he held his tongue as he dug into his hoodie's pocket and fished out the small ziplock of kitty band-aids. It had been Kurojairi's idea, to break his scratching habit by making him patch up his torn skin with something childish and humiliating. Shigaraki waited in frustrated silence as Dabi put the most hideous band-aid he could find in the bag on his neck. At least he wouldn't have to see it unless he looked in a mirror, but just knowing it was there was punishment enough. How was he supposed to be a fear-striking villain leader if he wore band-aids meant for kids? Compress came over as well. He had always been observant, and his calm demeanor reminded Shigaraki an awful lot of Kurojairi at times. He punctured a plastic straw into a juice box and held it out to Shigaraki. Shigaraki looked at it with disdain, crossing his arms petulantly. But Compress was insistent, forcing Shigaraki to take it. He grumbled about it, made sure to check the flavor, apple good, and took an angry sip. They all treated him like Kurojairi used to. It had originally annoyed Shigaraki to be treated almost as a child, but he had quickly grown to appreciate being taken care of, especially now that Kurojairi was gone. Being cared about, it felt like something he might have had once, from a person he's almost forgotten about. A person who cared about him, who held him and patched him up, but their memory was just out of reach. Still, the comfort of those forgotten memories was there, and served to make Shigaraki more thankful that he was taken care of here. But he would never say that he appreciated any of it. He had a reputation to uphold, after all. He would hold on to as much of his dignity as was still left, if there was any there to begin with. The text wasn't forgotten, but now that he had something in his system, he'd forgotten to eat today. That was what the clenching of his stomach meant. His head was a little bit clearer, and he called out to Toga, who was across the room playing Jenga with Twice and Spinner. She bounced over, smiling widely as she came to a stop before him. "You needed something, Tomura-kun?" He nodded, trying his best to ignore the Hello Kitty band-aid on his neck and the juice box in his hand. "I have a small job for you, if you're up for it." Toga smiled devilishly. "Oh, anything." This time, in place of the pros, instead a teary Fuyumi and an uncomfortable Natsuo entered the bleak little hospital room. And instead of standing around with a heavy presence as the pros had, Fuyumi was already running right up to Shudo's bedside, pushing aside his bangs and adamantly not looking at his exposed arms. "Oh, Shudo." She buried her face in his chest and wept. He tried not to focus on how the weight hurt. He probably deserved the pain after what he'd done. "I didn't want to believe it when they called." "I'm fine," Shudo assured, gut twisting and throat burning with the small statement. They had been right about it being painful to speak, but he wouldn't let himself feel better now. He deserved to suffer after what he'd tried to do. "It's okay." And really he was fine. He had to be. Things were okay now. He just hoped they could all go agree to pretend none of this had happened. It would be easier to pretend that it hadn't, so that he could go back to how things were. Because things were fine, he was fine. It would stay like that with nothing wrong. Everything was fine. "Oh, Shudo," Fuyumi breathed out softly, picking her head up from Shudo's chest to look at him with those teary eyes. "It's not okay." Her smile was unsteady, but there nonetheless. "You're not fine, and that's okay. It's okay to need help, Shudo. That's why we're here. We love you and we want to do what we can to help you." Natsuo hadn't said anything, hadn't moved since they'd come in. He bit his lip and came forward to stand beside Fuyumi hesitantly. "They told us what happened," Natsuo began, slowly as he took in his younger brother. "But they didn't tell us why. I don't really think they know." Fuyumi frowned at Shudo, obviously confused. "You haven't told them about Dad?" Shudo bristled. "Why would I tell them about him? Everything's fine now." Natsuo glanced at the heart monitor, which was now beating a little faster, but Fuyumi steadfastly ignored it, her attention trained solely on Shudo. "Shudo, I was there the other day." She pinched her lips, casting a worried look at Natsuo, probably to see how he would react to what she was saying. "I heard the sounds coming from the training room. Nothing about that has changed. And nothing about that has ever been fine." Natsuo's brow pinched with ire, though he said nothing. "It's really fine, Fuyumi," Shudo insisted, despite the fact that it felt like his fire quirk was centered in his throat. He couldn't care less at the moment. "It's nothing I can't handle anymore." Shudo. Fuyumi gently placed her hand on his cheek to cup his face, effectively silencing him. "What you're thinking and saying. It's not healthy. I used to think that way, when I would try to convince myself that Dad wasn't hurting you or Tuya." The names stung all of them, the three of them sharing a collective wince. "But to think that you have the same thoughts that I did, when you actually went through it?" She shook her head, biting her now trembling lip. "How can you do that?" "It's messed up," Natsuo said, crossing his arms. The anger in his voice was evident. "It's Endeavor's fault. Somehow he got it in your head the same way he did with Tuya, to think it's deserved, that it's an honor to have Endeavor beat the ever-loving shit out of a little kid." Shudo's fists clenched harder into the sheets. "No," he shook his head half-heartedly. "It's not like that." "Then tell me, Shudo." Natsuo placed a hand on one of Shudo's fists, white from how hard he was clenching the sheets. "What is it like?" But Shudo couldn't really put it into words. It was like they were looking at two different equations. To Shudo, there was no problem to address. His internal thought process these last few days was jumbled, and somewhere along the way he'd convinced himself that there was no problem. But he didn't know how to articulate any of that to his siblings, who obviously wouldn't buy it anyway. Instead, he hung his head in defeat, causing both of his siblings to let out a sigh. I want to stay with you, Shudo, Fuyumi began, voice trembling. But a part of me knows that you only let us in here because it would give you time to avoid talking to your teachers. Shudo raised his head to disagree, but no words would come out. Fuyumi could read him better than he thought she could. Weakness. For your sake, Fuyumi stood to her full height, brushing aside Shudo's bangs once more. We're going to go out into the hallway so you'll actually speak to your teachers. Shudo tried to protest, but his throat was so dry and painful that the only thing that came out was a pathetic croak. Fuyumi's eyes softened. Please talk to them, Shudo. Natsuo huffed as well, taking his hand from Shudo's to cross his arms once more. If you won't talk to them, then we will. Shudo's eyes widened, and he looked from Fuyumi to Natsuo and back again, seeking clarification that they wouldn't actually. Natsuo might, but Fuyumi? Fuyumi bit her lip, hanging her head slightly as she nodded. I'm sorry, Shudo. She took a deep breath to steady her voice. I don't want to be the bad guy, but I'm not letting this continue. I won't stand by and let you go into that training room alone with Dad ever again. I need to know you're safe. And if your teachers don't know about this, then I don't think you will be. She leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss on his forehead before pulling away and giving him a soft smile. Please, give them a chance. They can help you. Shudo bit his lip to keep it from trembling. Fuyumi took notice, patting his hand with hers once more. Is there anything you want us to do for you? Maybe I can make you food when you feel up to eating again? Shudo opened his mouth, forcing his throat to do what he wanted. Fuyumi and Natsuo both leaned forward as his voice came out in barely a whisper. Please, he croaked, blinking harshly so no tears would form in his eyes. He looked up at them, pleading. Don't tell her. Fuyumi frowned, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly. Who's Shudo? Shudo felt like his whole body wanted to tremble uncontrollably, but he refused to allow it. Instead, he forced himself to take a deep, shaky breath inward, steeling himself for what he absolutely had to say, absolutely needed them to hear. Don't tell Mom. It hurt, to see Todoroki so still, calm and emotionless, that Aizawa could almost believe that nothing was wrong. Todoroki had presented himself as always, a perfectly blank slate with no blemishes. Faultless. Statuesque. The fact that his heart could start beating so painfully while he still managed to expose no expression hurt Aizawa's chest. He was supposed to be able to tell when his students were hurting. Todoroki had every right, every reason, to expose his pent-up emotions, the emotions that had almost killed him. Todoroki should be allowed the luxury of being vulnerable for once, but instead he still did his absolute best to hide it. And honest to say, Aizawa might not have been able to see that anything was wrong at all had the heart monitor not given him away. His siblings had left the room, asking Aizawa and the others to go in and talk to him again, but Aizawa was starting to regret listening to them. Maybe he should have given Todoroki more time before coming back to question him. He answered a few questions with a nod or shake of the head. Are you doing okay? Nod, though obviously a lie. Are you hungry? Shake, he looked queasy at the mere mention of food. Do you want anything while we talk? Shake, he seemed determined to not admit to needing anything. Aizawa didn't want to ask another yes or no question. Those weren't getting him anywhere. He needed some sort of answer, and it would have to be verbal. What is endeavor to you? Todoroki opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. The heart monitor picked up ever so slightly. It took a few more minutes before, finally, Todoroki seemed to settle on an answer. His voice came out weak and hoarse. My father. Don't give me any of that, Todoroki. Aizawa's eyes hardened. I have never heard you call him that once over the duration of the entire year so far. How about this question? Hawks began, stepping up to get a little closer to the bed. Has endeavor ever hurt you? Todoroki bit his lip, seemingly trying to avoid the question. The monitor spiked. Todoroki squeezed his eyes shut and slowly shook his head. Aizawa sighed, frowning. Todoroki, his student stiffened. Can you look me in the eyes and tell me verbally? Todoroki opened his eyes and looked at Aizawa. He was almost startled by the brimming fear in his student's eyes as he opened his mouth in an attempt to answer. No, but it came out as a croak. Aizawa doubted anyone would believe that. Todoroki, Aizawa pinched the bridge of his nose and massaged his brow as he huffed, mulling it over. Finally, he picked his head back up to meet Todoroki's eyes. What drove you to try to kill yourself? The million-dollar question, and Aizawa was tired of stalling. He knew Todoroki, how stubborn he could be. If he didn't just outright ask him, Todoroki would take any opportunity to avoid answering truthfully. This was not a yes or no question. Todoroki would provide an answer, regardless of whether or not it was true. Aizawa was not giving him the option of an easy answer again. If he wanted to lie, he was going to have to put more work into it. It would be easier to tell the truth. Hopefully Todoroki would see that. Todoroki's voice caught in his throat, but the pros knew to be patient. If they interrupted him even once, he would seize the opportunity to avoid the question entirely. It's just Todoroki dropped his head, shielding his face from their sight. It was the first true display of his vulnerability. It was probably a hint that his walls were cracking. It's fine, he croaked, but it was so obviously a lie that even he seemed to know. I'm not going to do it again. Aizawa scooted his chair closer to Todoroki's bed, gaze softening. Even if you're not going to do it again, Aizawa mumbled softly, doing his best to comfort his student. You still tried to do it once. I want to know why so that I can help you. If I don't know what's wrong, then who knows if anyone can help if you decide to try again. Todoroki's breathing was stuttering, and he seemed to be trying to calm himself down. Aizawa allowed this. It wasn't an interrogation after all. He didn't want his student stressed or wary of the pros. He wanted his student to feel safe. It was blatantly obvious he hadn't felt safe in a while. The door opened then, revealing a nurse, and Aizawa just about wished he had Bakugo's quirks so he could explode something. Todoroki wasn't going to feel comfortable talking to anyone if people kept barging in. I'm sorry, the nurse said, and she actually seemed to mean it. That didn't make Aizawa any less mad about the intrusion though. Todoroki-san is here to see his son? The reaction was immediate, Todoroki sitting straight up in an attempt to get up from the bed. Luckily Hawks reacted quickly, grabbing Todoroki by the shoulders and keeping him steady. Aizawa was almost worried the heart monitor would break with how fast his student's heart was beating. No, don't Todoroki's eyes were wild and frantic. I can't I won't let him in if you don't want him here, Todoroki, Aizawa assured, and felt his heart ache at how quickly Todoroki deflated in relief. But I can't keep him out of this room for long unless we have a good reason to provide the hospital with. As a pro hero whose son is in the hospital, I would need a pretty good reason. Hawks asked the nurse to tell the hospital staff that Endeavor couldn't come into the room yet, per the patient's wishes. Aizawa kept his attention solely on Todoroki, who was trembling now. Todoroki, Aizawa softened his voice, coming closer but being careful to give his student space. Try to breathe with me, okay? He's not coming in here. We'll keep him away for now. If you can give me a reason, I can probably get his access to this room revoked permanently. Todoroki nodded, following what appeared to be well-practiced breathing exercises. Aizawa tried not to think about how many panic attacks one would have to have for them to be so experienced in the middle of one. It took him a few minutes to stop shaking, but eventually his breathing had more or less leveled out, and he leaned back against the elevated bed. Well, Todoroki bit his lip, still refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Still, the three pros in the room were well-practiced in patience. Have you ever heard of quirk marriages? Nothing ever happened to Shudo without Enji knowing about it. He made sure to check up on him nightly, and first thing in the morning. Although Shudo rarely ever responded to any of the messages, they were always at least read within a half hour. But now there were 6 messages that Shudo hadn't even looked at. So Enji had tried calling him. Shudo never dodged his calls. Occasionally he would hang up early, but he would always answer unless giving an express reason the second he saw the missed call. No reason came. Not one. Anyone would worry for their kid, especially when you were the #1 hero with a target on your back, and thus everyone else in your family was in danger of villains as well. But the school would have called him if a villain had attacked. The media would have been all over it if another student had been kidnapped. Enji considered that this might be a new type of rebellion Shudo was trying out, But Enji was fairly certain he had abandoned his petulant tantrums and was actually accepting his purpose now. He decided that, if he could get any information about this, it would be at Shudo's school. He had dropped by unexpectedly. Although, he didn't think it was so unexpected that no teacher was sent to greet him. He wasn't met with Eraserhead when he made his way into Shudo's class dorm building, nor had All Might attempted to make friends when Enji's presence was so obvious. Strange. For some reason, the students of Shudo's class seemed to be avoiding him, averting their eyes or drastically changing their direction whenever they strayed too close to him. Finally, the green one, Midoriya, shuffled up to him, meek-looking and pathetic as always. Sir?" His smile was strained. "To what do we owe this visit?" Enji scowled down at him. This was the boy whom Shudo had told. Regardless of his son's excuses, he didn't trust Shudo not to do something so childish and petty. "I am worried about Shudo," Enji said, keeping his voice level to not give away the anger he was forced to restrain. If he wanted these children to cooperate, he would need to act accordingly. "He hasn't been answering my calls or messages. Is he here? Is he safe?" After all, Enji wouldn't want his masterpiece to be in any way harmed. Midoriya's hands met together at the hem of his shirt, fiddling with it. He was definitely hiding something. "As a parent, it is my responsibility to look out for my son. If there is a reason I cannot, I would like to know." His glare hardened as the boy still was not able to form a coherent sentence, mumbling beneath his breath and mixing his syllables. "Todoroki-kun isn't here. He went with Aizawa-sensei. Where? I don't really know. It was a lie, maybe half true. He probably had an idea of where Shudo was, just not the exact location. Is there anyone willing to give me a better answer?" He looked around the common room, where most of the other children had tensed. He turned to the kitchen, where a blonde boy frantically went back to slicing cheese, and the other student to get in on recommendations, Yaoyorozu, ducked her head back over her steeping tea. "Guess you're out of luck." His eyes snapped over to the angry blonde who had won the sports festival, Deku. The heat in his glare rivaled Enji's, unrelenting and ruthless. So it would seem Enji would get nowhere with these children. He sighed, resigning himself to demanding the answers from Nizu or, if it came to it, Fuyumi or Natsuo. He was certain they were informed about this. They might have even been in on it to get back at Enji. He had just made it to the path leading to Yue's gate when he came upon two other students, who looked a little older than Shudo's class. "Did Aizawa appreciate the stuff you brought?" A loud blonde, very much like All Might used to be, slung his arm around his friend's shoulder, who began to flush a deep red. So, these two knew the whereabouts of Eraserhead? The small one had visited him? I think? I mean, he seemed genuine. I'm sure it helped a lot. Hospital chairs are super uncomfortable. Enji could feel a picture forming in his head. What's this about a hospital? I just hope Todoroki recovers soon. It took me months after my attempt before I started feeling any better. Todoroki. Recover. Attempt. Now it was starting to make sense. I'm sure he'll be doing better after he gets the help he needs, like you. He grinned widely, wrapping his arms around his friend's waist and spinning him around before setting him back down on his feet. We don't know his problems, but someone does. The teachers will help. The help he needs. Problems. Yes, Enji knew it now. Of course Shudo would be foolish enough to do something like that. What, was he trying to get Enji in trouble? He would thoroughly make up for his insolence. Enji stalked over to them, seeming to startle the smaller one, whereas the loud blonde only smiled up at him. "Hey, Endeavor, sir. Did you need something?" "Yes, I heard you talking about my son." The other two stiffened, looking at each other. "I cannot seem to find a member of UA's faculty who will talk to me about him. I consider it careless on their part, but I am worried about my son and the lack of information about him. Is there somewhere you can point me to?" He was working on the assumption that these two were ignorant of anything but Shudo's actions. It appeared they didn't know, which led them to tell Enji the gist of the situation and give him the address of which hospital he was staying at. This would be the last time Shudo thought of bringing such humiliation to the Todoroki household and Enji's name. He would make sure of it. If Shudo wanted to play dirty, then so be it. The more Todoroki talked, the more sick Hawks felt. He had been hoping that there might have been some misunderstanding, That maybe the reason he freaked out whenever Endeavor was brought up was because he didn't want his father to see him suffering or know what he'd tried to do. The first straw was the quirk marriage. Endeavor had bought Ray from her parents for the purpose of creating a child with the perfect quirk. The fact that it was something Hawks could picture Endeavor doing made him angrier. Then it was the kids. Endeavor had trained his eldest to become his successor but had not stopped having kids until the perfect child came along. He tossed aside his eldest and considered 3 of his children failures. He shunned and neglected them all. Then it was the isolation. Todoroki was forbidden from speaking to or being around his other 3 siblings. His room was moved to a more isolated part of the house, closer to Endeavor's room and the training dojo. The only other person he was allowed to interact with was his mother. Next it was the training. It sounded more like a series of brutal beatings to Hawks, the way Todoroki described it. The second his quirk had manifested, he spent every day puking or passing out. And then the mother. She had tried getting in the way of Endeavor's brutal training of a 5-year-old, which only put her in the line of fire. The abuse from her husband drove her crazy, to the point where she couldn't even see her kids anymore, instead only seeing him. She had apparently called Todoroki's left side unbearable, and then a sudden panic attack had caused her to pour boiling water on his face. Hawks wanted to puke at that. How awful it must have been to have the only person who comforted you, the only person who could help you, turn and scar you like that, both physically and psychologically. What seemed to be Todoroki's final point was Tuya, his brother, who had been trying to regain Endeavor's love and attention all this time, died by his own fire. He had been manipulated into thinking that Endeavor's abuse meant that he was privileged, not a failure. So once it had been taken away, he was desperate for any sort of validation from him again. He had asked Endeavor to meet with him so he could show his father all the training and hard work he'd put in, even though his quirk burned him. When Endeavor had failed to show up, Tuya's quirk had activated, presumably due to his mental instability, and it had gone out of control. It had gotten so bad that there wasn't even a body to recover, only charred remains. But the whole time, Hawks didn't think Todoroki actually said Tuya's name, and had only said the word mother once. After that, she was only called she, as though Todoroki couldn't bring himself to say much more about either. As Todoroki finished his tangent, the 3 pros stood in mortified silence. All Might had so far not said anything throughout the entire meeting, so Hawks didn't expect him to say anything. Hawks prided himself on his ability to always think of something to say, but right now he was speechless. Aizawa, who was usually able to keep a level head and not give away his emotions, was rigid in his chair, unable to rein his emotions in as Todoroki only looked down at his lap. Todoroki cleared his hoarse throat. It was obvious that it was still bothering him, and Hawks wished he could get a handle on himself and go get Todoroki some water, but he was still shell-shocked. I wasn't going to tell anyone. I didn't think it would be a big deal, now that he's changing. Surprisingly, it was All Might who snapped out of his stupor first. Is he changing? Todoroki barely spared him a glance. Yes. He's trying to be better to Fuyumi and Natsuo. He wants to atone for what he did. But is anything different about the abuse, young Todoroki? Hawks didn't miss the way Todoroki's fists clenched into the sheets. I'm getting stronger, so it's easier to deal with? All Might only sighed. That doesn't mean it's changing, nor does it mean Endeavor is changing. That means you're changing. Your body is adapting to the severity of the situation. And, Aizawa sighed, sitting up a bit straighter. I'm guessing this spiral began with the lessons on child abuse? Todoroki seemed to hesitate, but nodded nonetheless. I never really thought that it might be abuse until we had that lesson. The door opened again, revealing the same nurse from before. All right, we've temporarily revoked Endeavor-san's access to this room, but he's not happy about it. He wants to see his son, and is demanding to be let in. She frowned as a loud yell came from down the hallway, and Todoroki flinched slightly. We're going to need a reason to keep him out for good. Thank you, ma'am. All Might bowed, and the nurse blushed as she left the room. Hawks frowned at the others. How did he find out about this? I didn't think Nizu was going to tell him. Aizawa sighed, running a hand over his face. The Nizu I know would have taken this to his grave. Either Endeavor got it from the students, his other kids, Or if he somehow has Todoroki chipped. Todoroki scoffed bitterly. Wouldn't put it past him. But his tone was just a bit lighter, which made Hawk's chest swell just a little. We'll inform the hospital staff that he's under suspicion of abuse. Aizawa stood, nodding to Todoroki. They may not believe it, but by law they have to abide by the wishes of the patient if such claims are made. However, I hope you know that this means we'll be taking further action on this. Todoroki's shoulders slumped, but he nodded nonetheless. Yes, sir. And Todoroki? He looked up from his lap apprehensively. You don't have to tell everyone you're fine if you're not. It's okay to need help. Todoroki bit his lip, but nodded in affirmation. We'll let you talk to your siblings again, and then we have a few things that might help you. Someone visited and gave us a few things. Aizawa gave him a small smile. In the meantime, try to relax. You'll be okay for now. Shudo was glad the conversation was over. And despite what Aizawa had said, he didn't quite believe that he would be okay. He was supposed to be fine, but that had failed. He wasn't supposed to tell them anything, and yet he'd gone and done it anyway. He just didn't know why Fuyumi and Natsuo seemed to be happy about it. More than anything, Fuyumi wanted to believe that Endeavor was changing. She had been on his side, and had wanted to keep the family secrets hidden. But now she was glad that Endeavor would probably get punished for this. His chest did feel lighter than it had in years, probably. But it came with a sort of guilt. Endeavor said he was changing. He's trying to change. Did I just ruin all of that? Still, he gladly accepted the hug from Fuyumi, and when the pros returned, they were no longer seeking answers to difficult questions. In place of their questions, they instead supplied what someone had supposedly brought them. His only reaction had been confusion when they gave him a deformed stuffed animal about the size of his palm. He turned it around in his hands, eyeballing it for a few minutes to try to figure out what it was supposed to be. When he couldn't come up with anything, he shot a questioning look at Aizawa. His teacher merely shrugged. Don't know either. Shudo turned back to look at it once again. It could have been one of 3 animals off the top of his head, and it was extremely ugly. So many flaws, so imperfect, and yet. Shudo felt the smallest smile tug at his lips as he looked at it. He immediately loved the thing. He was allowed one imperfection in his life, right? Well, this silly little stuffed whatever it was wore its imperfections shamelessly, in a way Shudo never could. He liked the reminder that imperfect things can still be loved. But he really shouldn't take such comfort in that thought. Shudo wasn't supposed to be imperfect, wasn't supposed to be loved. He was born to be a masterpiece. If he failed at that, then all of those years of torture in that training room, all those times she stood in front of him to take the blow, would be meaningless. Shudo would not let her be reduced to meaningless. That had destroyed his oldest brother, had left Fuyumi and Natsuo abandoned. Shudo wished that they could have been given meaning in Endeavor's eyes, but that would only mean that they would be more battered pawns in his play to victory. That had been Shudo's price of being meaningful. Shudo had never really felt meaningful outside of that training room. In a twisted way, he was dependent on the abuse. It kept him standing tall. It meant that he was allowed to be strong. If he hadn't been let into that training room, then it meant that he was nothing. But he didn't want his self-worth to originate from the feeling of cold, hardwood on his face, from the smell of smoke and vomit, from the severe lack of breath and overabundant presence of pain. Slowly, he looked back up from the toy. He wanted to say that he no longer liked it, but regrettably he did. Some small part of himself still wanted to assure him that he wasn't perfect, didn't have to be, and it was okay. But it wasn't okay to be imperfect. Thankfully, Endeavor had trained him until he had become perfect, forged under pressure until he emerged as a flawless diamond. He was perfect, so everything was fine, right? Aizawa went home that night. Although he didn't like the idea of not being by Todoroki's side, he knew it would be for the best. He hadn't slept decently since before the whole ordeal had started. The room was quiet, which was unusual. He stayed in the faculty dormitories just a few minutes away from the student dorms. He could have gotten his own room, but he and Hizashi didn't see the need to be separated. Maybe it should be less unusual for their dorm to be so quiet at such a late hour, but Aizawa knew that Hizashi was almost always up late, either planning a radio show or doing his lesson plans last minute. Hisashi might have been just as tired as Aizawa after having to take over responsibility for Class 1A. Aizawa knew they could be a handful. However, it was proven that his assumption about Hisashi sleeping had been wrong. As soon as he entered the bedroom, he found his husband scrolling away on his phone, a frown on his face. "Zashi?" Hisashi looked up, smiling gently when he laid his eyes on Aizawa, who almost definitely looked worse for wear. He got up from the bed and made his way over, helping his husband shrug off his bag and jacket as Aizawa kicked off his shoes. Changing into pajamas was a blur of gentle movements and warm touches, which was especially refreshing after all Aizawa had had was hard chairs and cold hallways. "How is he?" Aizawa hummed as he slid into bed, snuggling under the extra soft and warm covers. "Better. Still not great, but he's awake and talking." "Talking? Did he?" Hisashi's unasked question hung in the air for a few minutes without being addressed. Finally, Aizawa sighed, sitting up in bed just slightly. "He talked about Endeavor," Aizawa said, earning an alarmed look from his husband. Hisashi climbed into bed beside him, hissing when his warm legs pressed against Aizawa's cold skin. "What did he say?" Aizawa ran a tired hand over his face, muffling a low groan. "He said a lot, Hisashi. So much that I think we'd have a pretty solid case against Endeavor." Hisashi frowned, running calloused fingertips over Aizawa's elbow in a calming manner. "So, it's really true? Your theory about Endeavor?" Aizawa sighed more deeply this time, sinking into the mattress a little more as he melted into Hisashi's touch. "More than I thought. Could barely stomach the whole story." He turned his head to press his face into Hisashi's side, exhaustion overwhelming him now that he was actually comfortable. "Kid's gone through so much I kinda wanna screw Hero Protocol just to strangle Endeavor." Hisashi hummed, which Aizawa could feel from where his head was laying. "Well, get some rest, Sho. You're not going to be able to put up much of a fight against the #1 hero if you're too tired to hold a conversation with your oh-so-wonderful husband." Aizawa huffed out the slightest laugh, letting his eyes slide closed as Hisashi scooted farther down in bed to be even with him. He certainly felt like he could sleep for 3 days. "Love you, Zashi." "Love you too, Sho." Hawk stayed with Todoroki in the hospital so that All Might and Aizawa could both go home and rest. Hawks had offered to stay and remain awake to watch over the kid. Besides, Hawks didn't think he could have gotten any rest if he had gone home. Endeavor had left in a fit. He was not told expressly why he hadn't been let in the room. The hospital staff hadn't been able to say it to his face, so they just told him that he couldn't go into the room for now. Of course, Hawks had worked with Endeavor for a while. Though the hospital staff, along with Aizawa and All Might, believed they would be rid of Endeavor for at least a few days, Hawks felt almost itchy at the thought of putting that theory to the test. He offered to stay with Todoroki not only to watch the kid, but also to assure himself that Endeavor would not be able to get into the room. If there was one person who stood a chance at keeping the #1 hero out, it was the #2 hero. He checked in every half hour, making sure Todoroki slept soundly and didn't try anything now that he was mostly left alone. He had assured the pros earlier that he would not try to kill himself again, but he was a little too unstable during that conversation for Hawks to believe that. A nurse he didn't recognize approached him, handing him a cup of steaming coffee. He thanked her with a smile, taking a small sip. Somehow, she'd managed to make it exactly how he liked it. "It's a very dedicated thing to do, staying here and watching the kid." Hawks nodded, taking another sip. "This is what heroes do. We're supposed to look out for people in need. Right now, this kid needs someone, though I don't think he knows that yet. People admire dedication to a cause." The nurse continued, her smile turning sharper. "Something about that was familiar. Loyalty is something you can't find everywhere. It's something we appreciate, especially Tomura-kun." "Tomura-kun?" Hawks went rigid, staring at the nurse, whose eyes were now a shining yellow, boring into him like they were having the most casual conversation in the world. "Toga?" She smiled, putting a finger to her lips as a gesture for him to be quiet. However, his mind began reeling. What was she? "Why am I here?" His eyes snapped back to her. "That's what you're thinking, right?" She giggled, running one of her hands through her hair in a playful gesture. "I just love long hair, you know? I mean, I hate having it in my face when I'm trying to get some delicious blood. But Dash? Toga? Fine, fine. She rolled her eyes. Always so impatient. Socks. I thought you were fun, like Twice and Compress. Not a stick in the mud like Dobby and Spinner. Toga, Shadash? I'm here to check up on him. She smiled innocently, though her eyes were anything but innocent right now. You've been pretty good about keeping us updated, but you didn't tell us that you got the scoop on Endeavor. Hawks quickly glanced around the hallway, trying to make sure nobody was around. He couldn't see anyone, but he sent a few of his feathers to keep watch in case someone did happen to wander too close to them. He talked about Endeavor and what led him to act accordingly, but I'm not really supposed to tell anyone. Wouldn't want there to be leaks. Dash. Oh, we've been through this already. Toga apparently had no qualms interrupting him every chance she got. Who would listen to us? Just tell me the details. You know who's going crazy tearing his hair out about this? Hawks was glad that she was at least keeping her voice down when she spoke in that excited tone. Shigaraki? Tomura-kun? She raised an eyebrow, giving him a confused look. No, silly. Dobby, he's been pacing since you left. But he's not the only one who wants to know what's going on. Dobby, Hawks hadn't pegged him as the anxious type, especially when it came to hero kids. He seemed to care the bare minimum about the rest of the League of Villains. Look, we can talk about it when I visit the base next. But not here. This is too public. You're going to get caught. You're going to get me caught? You don't give me any credit. Toga pouted, crossing her arms. Still don't know why you like Twice more. Am I not fun enough? At least Twice doesn't make surprise visits to me in public. Dash. He would if he could, and we both know it. Just, are we done here? Can you go before you get us both in a lot of trouble? Alright, shish. What crawled up your ass this morning? She uncrossed her arms, waving them at him as he opened his mouth to tell her off again. Fine, I'm going okay? But you better come to the base soon if you don't want another surprise visit. Hawks nodded hastily, watching her walk away. He made sure a few of his feathers followed her until she was out the door of the hospital. Then he called them back to him. Finally, he felt like he could breathe again, shoulders relaxing as he let out a shaky sigh of relief. Although, this did mean that at some point he would be obligated to leave Todoroki in someone else's care while he went back to the base of the League of Villains to tell them. He had no doubt that another member, even more obvious than Toga, would try to sneak in. Hawks knew that Dobby had a habit of being extra reckless whenever he was fidgety. Although, that did beg the question, why was Dobby the most upset by the whole ordeal? Hawks didn't know much about him, but generally Twice or Spinner were the most empathetic. Dobby was at the bottom of that list. Hawks decided to just chalk it up to Dobby's greatest enemy, Endeavor, being involved. Nothing else made any sense. But still, he couldn't help the nagging feeling at the back of his mind that wouldn't let up even a little. Aizawa returned Thursday morning for class. Midoriya took this as a good sign. Their teacher probably wouldn't have returned unless Todoroki was doing okay, right? The second he took the podium, several hands shot up in insistence. Aizawa looked over them with tired eyes before sighing. He raised his hand to silence those who were already voicing their worries. Before you all ask, he mumbled, surveying the students in turn. Todoroki is currently in recovery. He woke up yesterday afternoon. A collective sigh of relief was let out across the classroom, several students visibly wilting in relief. Midoriya held up his hand sheepishly. When will he be returning to class? Aizawa cast him a quick glance before addressing the whole class. It's hard to say. It depends on the physical and psychological recovery time. Until we receive a full report, I won't have a proper estimation. And what about Shitfire? Midoriya startled, looking over at Kaken, who was probably glaring at Aizawa, though Midoriya could only see the side of his face. Do we know anything about Endeavor? Kaken restated, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. Or is UA still not ready to address that? Aizawa blinked, clearly not having expected the class to put so much together on their own. Nonetheless, he turned away from Kaken to address the class once again. I don't know how much you've managed to figure out. He fixed Midoriya with a pointed look. Present Mike must have told him that it had mostly been Midoriya poking around. But in regard to this issue, actions are already being taken to handle the situation. Kakin obviously had been looking for a less vague answer, if the clenching of his jaw was anything to go by. Midoriya saw another hand raise out of the corner of his eye, but Aizawa held up his hand. No more questions right now. He was immediately met with several complaints, but quickly shut them down with a glowing glare. We have a lesson to get through. The students resigned themselves to the lesson, not asking any more questions about Todoroki until they were dismissed. They moved to the locker rooms to change, although the guys avoided the connecting bathroom, where ice was still taking its time to melt. Apparently, the school had been swamped with other issues, primarily Todoroki himself, so the ice was due to be removed later. Midoriya was a little surprised to see All Might there, although he supposed that he and Aizawa had returned from the hospital together. It left Midoriya wondering if there was anyone staying with Todoroki. Surely it would be hard to keep Endeavor out of the room without a pro. It hurt Midoriya to think that maybe Endeavor had access to the room, that he was allowed in to chew out his son. Different worries still plagued Midoriya all throughout hero training, to the point where he was limping by the end. He ignored the injury as it was minor, instead trying to get to lunch as quickly as possible to get some food in him. Hopefully that would take his mind off of other things for a while. Aizawa had been on a call when they'd come back from lunch. He'd made a quick end to the call and gestured for them to leave again. Instead of another lesson, you're going to be joining Class 1B for a joint rescue exercise in Ground Gamma. He fixed them with one more glare as he locked the classroom behind him. I trust you will behave for Vlad King and Midnight? Midoriya cocked his head, confused. Was Aizawa not coming with them? True to that, Aizawa walked Class 1A to Ground Gamma, but immediately turned around and left, leaving his class with the other teachers. Midoriya couldn't help but notice that Aizawa looked a little frantic in his steps. It had honestly not been Shudo's intention to rip out the 4 in his right arm, or the other 4 in his left arm. It was an accident. Sure, he might have been trying to reopen the wounds on his arms by incessantly scratching at his marred skin, but that was another thing. The sound of Endeavor, an angry Endeavor, just down the hallway had been jabbing at Shudo's sanity for hours. After he had been denied entry into Shudo's room the day before, he'd stormed out in a fit, and they'd thought that would be the end of it. If it didn't hurt so much, Shudo would have been tempted to laugh at the naivete of the hospital staff and pro-heroes present. They had too much faith in Endeavor. Aizawa and All Might had returned to UA under the assumption that they wouldn't have to deal with Endeavor for a while. They expected him to come back in a couple days in hopes that Shudo would change his mind, but never so early as the following day. Shudo had known better, but he hadn't voiced his worries to any of them. A part of him felt that if Endeavor were to come and punish him for his actions, he might end up dying from it. So he'd kept quiet, hoping that it would take more than Hawks to keep Endeavor out of the room so that he could pull the plug with his fists or fire. No such luck. Shudo didn't get whatever nice things he wanted. Instead, Endeavor fussed for hours just down the hallway, close enough to put Shudo on edge, brimming with anxiety, but not close enough to put his worries at ease because if Endeavor gets in this room, I'm a dead man. Hawks was standing outside the room, both to periodically check on Shudo and also to act as a barrier between the room and Endeavor. Shudo had been meticulously counting the time intervals at which Hawks would check in. When Endeavor was extra loud, it would be every 5 minutes. However, when Endeavor was quieter, it was every 10 minutes. Hawks had just checked in, and Endeavor seemed to be quieting down, so Shudo had seized the opportunity to administer whatever pain he could get from the wounds. It would serve to not only take his mind off of Endeavor's presence, but should also return some control to Shudo. He had been so blinded by panic, Endeavor's voice and the time limit looming over him, that he hadn't been careful enough with his movements. He somehow managed to claw out the 4 in his right arm, which was immediately engulfed by pain. He hissed, gasping quietly at the sensation. It was better than he had been hoping for. So maybe he lied in saying that he hadn't meant to pull out the second 4. Endeavor's voice was starting to rise, and Shudo knew he didn't have a lot more time to enjoy his control. He ended up yanking the other one out with no grace or precision, ripping at his skin a little. For a few euphoric minutes, he existed in what felt like between realms, the pain both surreal and grounding. He felt like he was floating but was still under a lot of weight. kind of like what he assumed drowning would feel like. He used to imagine the different ways he could die all the time. Somehow this felt better than what he'd pictured as a kid. It ended once the sound of a door opening could be vaguely heard. It was followed by a loud gasp and thundering footsteps. As the sensation began to die down, he noticed just how painful it really was. His arms ached and his entire body screamed at him. Something warm was dripping down his right arm. It occurred to him that one of the IVs, the one in his right arm, had been the blood transfusion inserted into one of his veins. Along with all the scratching, he was probably losing a bit more blood than he'd intended. The other 4, in his left arm, had been the pain meds, administered slowly so that it was only a little at a time. Because there hadn't been a constant stream for a couple minutes, the pain in his stomach due to the overdose was starting to kick in. People were around him now, and he would have kicked them away if he had the strength. He wasn't naive enough to think that this would be enough to die, but he wanted to entertain the fantasy while he could. He was whining, he realized. Involuntarily, of course, but still whining nonetheless. He felt a warm hand settle gently on his head, and gasped lightly at the soft touch. It felt almost like the softest touch in the world. "I'm here, Puss." That was certainly a surprise. Shudo wouldn't have guessed the pro-hero's hand could be so gentle, voice so soft. Shudo found that he couldn't open his eyes to clarify for himself that he wasn't dreaming. "Hang on, okay? Whatever's going through your head, we'll figure it out." Shudo hummed, body relaxing just slightly. "That's it. I'm here, kiddo. Right here." Aizawa had never glared harder in his life. He almost thought he would burst a blood vessel in his forehead at this point. Todoroki had pulled out both IVs, seemingly on purpose. Although it would appear it was mostly due to tearing at his wounds. If it was an attempt at self-harm again, Aizawa could guess why he was feeling out of control. Aizawa had erased Endeavor's quirk the second he'd arrived. Without it, he was just an adult throwing a child's tantrum. It had quickly diffused the worst of the situation, as no one was going to be intimidated by his hero status when he wasn't surrounded by his flames. It became evident that Endeavor was no longer in control of the conversation. As the one who now controlled whether or not Endeavor had access to his quirk, Aizawa was the center of control. The hospital staff seemed extremely relieved at that. Eraserhead, Endeavor growled, still trying to assume an authoritative position. "I would like to know why I can't see Shudo." "He asked us to keep you out," Aizawa stated blandly, enjoying the way Endeavor's face morphed into one of both shock and anger. "He doesn't want to see you." "But I'm his father. Maybe you should have thought of that before doing something to make him not want to let you anywhere near him." Aizawa made sure to sharpen his glare. He wanted Endeavor to know exactly what the rest of them had heard from Todoroki. And judging by the next face he made, he got the hint. Aizawa tried not to let his satisfaction show on his face as Endeavor's eyes roamed just slightly over the group of people refusing to look at him, apprehension clear. He obviously did not like even the notion that others knew about everything he's done to his family. Aizawa didn't wait around to see what Endeavor would do. Instead, he marched past and made his way down the hallway. He wanted an update from Hawks about Todoroki. Last he'd been told, Hawks had been ushered out of the room so the hospital staff could work. Hawks was slumped in his chair, furiously typing away at his phone. He had seemed rather attached to it lately. "Report." Hawks nearly jumped out of his chair at the sound of Aizawa's voice, clutching his chest and chuckling breathily as he finally saw Aizawa. "Snuck up on me." Aizawa crossed his arms. Didn't think the number 2 hero would be so jumpy. "Hey, I am not jumpy." Hawks pursed his lips, pocketing his phone. "You came out of nowhere." "I wasn't ready." "Sounds like jumpy to me," Aizawa muttered, taking a seat next to Hawks. "So, report?" "Doctor came out a few minutes ago," he said, gesturing to the door. "Said the kid was going to be all right from that. Just gave us all a good scare." Aizawa sighed, massaging his brow. Todoroki sure had been giving them scares left and right these days. Not that he could exactly blame his student. It has been rough on all of them, but especially for him. "Is he awake?" Hawks shook his head. "Passed out halfway through. He's been in and out since, but not long enough to note. Doctor says he's not lucid enough when he is awake, so we're going to have to wait this out." Aizawa nodded, though he wasn't pleased. He thought about getting a restraining order on Endeavor for the time being, or getting him banned from entering the hospital entirely, but he was sure Endeavor would find a way to twist any more action against him to backfire. If they didn't let Endeavor have certain freedoms, he'd use that to make himself look like a victim when it counted later. He steadfastly refused to let Todoroki go back to his old home, not with Endeavor. So if it would make a difference in the long run, Aizawa would suffer through this time when he could do nothing. Rei sat stock still on her bed. NG hadn't ever paid her a visit, hadn't wanted to now that he had gotten what he had wanted out of her. A perfect child with a perfect quirk. She had never expected him to show up to her hospital room, demand that she stay quiet and sit on her bed with no complaints. She couldn't move, her entire body as rigid as ice. If she wasn't made to take daily quirk suppressant pills by the hospital staff to make sure she wasn't a danger to herself or others, she might have accidentally activated her quirk by now. I come to you in a dire circumstance. NG's voice was low as always. He had never needed to raise his voice, as there had never been a dissenting voice to challenge him in their household. His words were absolute, cold and harsh. Ironically, his anger was more ice than fire. Shudo is in the hospital. NG's voice did not relent, did not soften. Sharp and cold as ever. He is dying. Rei felt herself freeze, but in a different way than before. Her little Shudo, dying? It couldn't be. She had already lost Tuya, hadn't even been there for him. She'd been banished from her family, and now she was losing her precious Shudo? She tried her best to force out any words, any at all, but in the face of her husband she could not. She began to tremble with fear that she could not ask after the health of her baby, fear that NG would fly off the handle now that his masterpiece was in danger, fear that he had come to visit her because he needed her to create another masterpiece. It was you. Rei lifted her head, just enough to see NG's eyes, but not enough to look into them. He seemed angry, but also withdrawn. He did it himself. NG continued, giving Rei no time to process any of what he was trying to say. Cuts and pills. Even tried to jump. If Rei hadn't been speechless before, then she certainly would be now. The tears that had been building in her eyes since NG had first announced his arrival now began to swell and fall down her face. Her throat began to ache with sobs she was too scared to release as NG continued to look at her. No, please, go away. Her baby, suicide? But why? He had been so lively the last time he'd visited her. It was you, NG said again, and this time Rei looked up at him fully. She had to know if he was sincere. You made him dependent on you, and then crushed his spirit. NG's eyes hardened, his glare deepening. You never loved him and he knows it. You failed him, giving him false dreams only to tear him down. He hasn't smiled since you scarred him. Rei choked on another sob, this time too distraught to swallow it down. No, surely not. Shudo had smiled at her when she had seen him last. Or had he? Had it been a wince now that she thought about it? She couldn't listen. She couldn't go down this path. You made him hate himself by calling him unbearable. You made him suffer. And no, another sob cut her off, causing her to choke on her words. I didn't. You did. NG stood, towering over her once again with that all-consuming shadow. He killed himself because of you? Shudo. Shudo is dead then? She had lost Shudo just like Tuya. Shudo had killed himself because of her. It was her fault, she wasn't there. Just like she hadn't been there for Tuya when he'd needed her either. Another son's death, and it was her fault. She hadn't noticed when NG had left the room, nor when a nurse had barged in. The nurse was trying to pry Rei's hands from their death grip on her hair, pulling and scratching and doing anything to bleed for Shudo, for Tuya. Her babies, she had failed them again. Would Natsuo be next? Fuyumi? She couldn't bear the thought. She kicked and screamed and thrashed as she was strapped down to her bed. She wailed as they tried to talk to her. She cried as it all sank deeper than she had ever allowed. Shudo is dead. Because of me. He killed himself. She couldn't handle it. Not him. Not one of her precious babies. Please. Please. Not Shudo. That bastard. Hawks watched in shock as Natsuo shot up from his chair. He had arrived half an hour ago, once his classes had let out. He'd seemed worried ever since he'd gotten there, asking for more details that they hadn't shared over the phone about what exactly Shudo had done. Natsuo? Fuyumi was also there, having arrived a few minutes ago. What's wrong? Mom's hospital called. At this, Fuyumi immediately tensed up. And? Endeavor visited her. Natsuo bit out, scowling. He told her about Shudo. Fuyumi gasped, standing up as well to face Natsuo. What did the hospital say? She's in hysterics? Natsuo growled, putting his hand over the receiver of his phone to mute his voice. He leaned closer to Fuyumi. She thinks he's dead. Clearly Endeavor is not trustworthy when passing on information. And she thinks it's her fault. I wouldn't be surprised if Endeavor was responsible for that too. Fuyumi sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. I guess we failed the one instruction Shudo gave us. No, Natsuo placed his hand on her shoulder, his expression reassuring but his eyes still burning with anger. We didn't tell her, Endeavor did. That man is responsible for his own actions, and right now he's acting like a petulant child. Fuyumi smiled, patting Natsuo's hand with her own before turning to Hawks and Aizawa, who both stood up to face her at eye level. We'll probably have to leave to go see our mother. She smiled sheepishly, Natsuo walking away to continue his call with the other hospital. I don't know if they're going to want anyone visiting her, but we have to console her about this. I mean, Shudo isn't dead, and it's nowhere near her fault. Of course, Aizawa nodded. You both can go attend to her once ready. We'll tell Todoroki dash. Could you please? She laughed awkwardly, clearly embarrassed at having interrupted Aizawa, though he didn't appear to be upset at all. Don't tell Shudo why we've left? Just make something up, we don't want him to worry about Mom. It'll just make things harder on him than they have to be. Aizawa nodded, looking to Hawks. You can count on us. Hawks gave her an okay sign with his fingers. Just leave it to the pros. She smiled, shaking her head before looking off to where Natsuo had run off to. I'd better go see what the hospital is saying. She turned back to the pros and gave a slight bow to them. Thank you for everything that you're doing, especially for Shudo. We really appreciate it. It's no trouble. She stood up and turned on her heel to follow after her brother. The second she was out of range, Aizawa punched the wall with force. Hawks jumped away, at first startled by Aizawa's action. What was that about? He asked, watching warily as Aizawa lowered his fist. Did the wall offend you or something? I'm going to kill Endeavor. Hawks blinked as realization dawned on him. Pissed at Endeavor, huh? He probably went and tormented his wife just to upset her and worry the whole family. Aizawa sneered, sitting back down in his chair. Hawks remained standing, a good few feet from him. It was almost definitely meant to be a power move to remind his family that he's still in power over them. I've seen it all the time in abuse cases. It hurt Hawks' heart to have his once favorite hero be related to an abuse case, but at this point what else was it? If not abuse, then was there even a correct term for it? He sighed, finally sitting back down in his chair. It was astonishing how one conversation could drain him of his energy. It was also astonishing exactly how worried he could be for one kid. One kid who was already getting help, already recovering, still alive. But a part of Hawks knew that this ordeal was far from over. It wouldn't be over until Todoroki was out of Endeavor's care, trusted to someone else, and Endeavor was prosecuted for his crimes. Frankly, Hawks was worried. He knew that he wouldn't be able to sleep well at night until all of those came to pass. But he would gladly take it onto his shoulders. The thought that lingered in the back of his mind, one which he refused to address at the moment, was that the world very well could be on its way to losing yet another #1 hero, and it would be up to Hawks to fill that position. He didn't think he could be a symbol for anyone, bringing comfort and glee with the mere words of I am here. He could barely be there for the people who needed him already. He could barely offer anything to the little Todoroki as he sat in the hallway outside of his hospital room. Nonetheless, he was here. Not with a huge presence or an unwavering smile, but he was here. For Todoroki. For a kid who was hurting, and who needed a little support from the people who were willing to give it to him. He was here, for someone in need, someone who desperately needed to smile again. Sorry. It was the first word out of Shudo's mouth once the pros came in. He couldn't have stopped it from coming out if he wanted to. For some reason, he was inexplicably, unconditionally sorry. For what? He didn't even know. You don't have to be sorry, Todoroki, Aizawa said, not bothering to take a seat as he stood a few feet from Shudo's bedside. So, they weren't staying long then? From what the doctors said yesterday, it sounds like pulling out both IVs was an accident. Shudo frowned. Well, partially. Of course, we know it was an attempt at reopening your wounds, Aizawa conceded, though his expression remained soft and reassuring. But that's nothing to get angry at you for. You're hurting and we know that. That's why we're trying to help you. Shudo hung his head. He didn't deserve this treatment. Even though they were trying to help him, he showed his gratitude by ripping out his IVs and continuously going against their instructions. He was doing the exact opposite of assisting them in helping him get better. I just wanted to tell you that for now, you'll be in Hawk's care, Aizawa said, giving said pro a side glance before he continued. Until we can be sure that we can keep Endeavor out of UA, you'll spend your time recovering in this hospital until you're discharged, and Hawks will take you until you're considered ready to go back to school. Hawks nodded along. They'd probably gone over this in the hallway. Still, Shudo was a bit apprehensive. After all, Hawks had worked closely with Endeavor before. I know you'll be skeptical, as is your right, Aizawa continued, taking a step closer so that he could more properly meet Shudo's eyes. But we're worried that Endeavor has too much of a handle over your siblings to send you to be with them. And moving you back into the dorms before you're ready doesn't seem like a wise choice either, even if you're not immediately put back into classes. After all, you'd be surrounded by your worried classmates, and they'd probably end up trying to bother you. Classmates? A sharp electric shock shot up Shudo's spine at that word. He'd hardly given them any thought since he'd been hospitalized. God, what did they think of all of this? Shudo would have buried his face in his hands if it didn't hurt so much to lift them, especially now after having ripped out the IVs. There's one more option if you don't want to stay with Hawks. Shudo was exceptionally grateful that Aizawa had cut off that train of thought before it could spiral. He needed a break from his own head. But I didn't think you'd want to hear it. Aizawa frowned, expression growing just a bit more cautious. If you were taken under Hawk's care, you'd still have to regularly see a therapist. If you were to refuse, the hospital staff instructed me to tell you that their next course of action would be a mental hospital until you were rehabilitated. So much for not spiraling. Shudo shook his head as violently as he possibly could. No, he wouldn't allow it. He would not end up in one of those places. Not like her. Shudo hadn't even noticed Aizawa's hands on his shoulders, steadying his vicious movements, until he squeezed. Shudo looked up to him, at least momentarily snapped out of his tirade of panic. It's entirely up to you, Aizawa reassured him, removing his hands from Shudo and taking a step back to allow him space to breathe. I don't want to back you into a corner with only two options to choose between, but right now they're the only options available. We didn't think it would be a good idea for any of your teachers to take you in because then it may seem that UA is conspiring against Endeavor, which could screw up our case. As someone involved, who is also fully capable of keeping you out of trouble, Hawks is the best logical choice. Shudo glanced over at Hawks, wanting to see what he thought of all of this. But, frustratingly, Shudo could not get a read on the number 2 hero. His smile was the same as always, and he didn't seem to hate the idea. But he worried that Hawks was just doing this out of obligation, and Shudo didn't want to be a burden that Hawks didn't want. Relax, kid. Hawks waved his hand nonchalantly. I know you're probably worried about where I stand on the whole arrangement, but I'll be happy to help any way that I can. He seemed genuine enough with his words, but Shudo still couldn't help but second-guess the whole thing. Still, he agreed to stay with Hawks over the other, less favorable option. As soon as the two pros left, Shudo found himself melting back into his bed. The thought of leaving the hospital almost sickened him. This room felt like the only place where Endeavor couldn't reach him. By law, he wasn't allowed in. There was nothing like that keeping him out of anywhere else. As number 1 pro hero, he could basically go anywhere as long as he could justify himself later. And if the number 2 hero had been keeping his son from him, who in their right mind would tell Endeavor off for doing whatever was in his power to get his son back? This could just end up getting Hawks in trouble. But he couldn't stay in the hospital forever, and he wouldn't allow anyone to put him away in one of those psychiatric prisons. If Hawks was the best he had, he would make the most of it. He would have to. It's not that Aizawa didn't trust Hawks to look after one of his students. No, it was more like he didn't trust that Hawks wouldn't be working with Endeavor soon and perhaps let something slip. Aizawa knew he should give the number 2 hero some credit. He was where he was in the hero rankings for a reason, but Hawks had the tendency to overshare. He used flowery words and long anecdotes as a defense mechanism whenever someone made him nervous or fidgety. And being in such a compromising situation as secretly housing the number 1 hero's kid, Aizawa figured it was reasonable to expect that anyone would get anxious, especially when working in close proximity to the kid's father. But he couldn't exactly tell Hawks to avoid working with Endeavor for the time being. That would be extremely suspicious, given how ecstatic Hawks usually is when given the opportunity to work with Endeavor. It would practically be a dead giveaway if Hawks suddenly began to avoid his idol like the plague. So they had told Hawks to try to behave as normally as possible. Whether or not he could pull it off was another question. But Aizawa chose to have faith that Hawks could do this. Otherwise, he might start getting overly anxious himself, and that would be the least rational response to have to this situation right now. They proceeded as normal, Aizawa returning to UA as soon as Todoroki was released from the hospital late Friday night. They did it in the dead of night, so that they could escape any media who might have been camped outside the hospital during the day, and to avoid Endeavor, in case he decided to try to intervene. Todoroki had been out the entire day before after his emergency operation, so he had been fine staying up to maximize efficiency. Of course, Aizawa still felt guilty that they'd had to ask something else of him on top of everything he already had to deal with. Aizawa had gone right to bed as soon as he was certain that Todoroki would be fine. He had wanted to stay with him and Hawks longer, but was completely wiped out from the ordeal, as well as teaching that Friday morning. He hadn't wanted to tip off to any students that Todoroki was still hurting exorbitantly, so he'd gone back Thursday after it had been deemed that Todoroki was not lucid enough for conversation. He woke up late on Saturday, which was unlike him. Sure, he liked to sleep, but usually couldn't get a full night's sleep. Being a pro, he was used to having to be woken up at any time to be on call for other heroes or UA's faculty, so any sound could wake him up. Hisashi must have been pretty careful when getting up this morning. He checked in on his class at lunch, just to make sure no one was doing anything crazy. Apparently, most of them had decided to stay for the weekend. Aizawa had a pretty good idea why. He figured they all just wanted to be here for any immediate updates on Todoroki, and to provide support to each other as they waited. He frowned upon hearing that Midoriya and Bakugo were called to their work study, which meant they'd be serving beside Endeavor. Please, problem children. Don't do anything stupid. Just this once. But that plea was probably too much to ask of them. He just settled for hoping that they didn't do anything too stupid that would perhaps get them into trouble. He had been sure that Tokoyami would have been absent, as Hawks had told Aizawa in the waiting room that he'd scheduled to borrow him for his work study. However, upon checking in with Hawks this morning, he had been told that he'd cancelled, so that he could help Todoroki settle in for the day. It seemed that Uraraka and Azui were also gone for their work studies, which made Aizawa frown. Those two were good at crowd management and calming down their classmates. If their abilities were needed at any time, it would be now, as everyone in Class 1A seemed to be fidgeting with the same anxious energy. Aizawa had already been asked 5 different times how Todoroki was doing, and he was happy to say that he was doing better, according to Hawks. His students all seemed to be relieved when Aizawa had told them that Todoroki was now officially discharged from the hospital, and was housed somewhere Endeavor couldn't reach him for the time being. Yaoyorozu had suggested that they all make Todoroki a gift basket as a sign that they're thinking about him, and wish his recovery to be swift and easy. Aizawa would have stopped them, as he wasn't sure how Todoroki would receive any sort of gift, but upon seeing their faces of glee, he couldn't bring himself to shut them down. Tamaki popped into his head just then, reminding him of how Todoroki had seemed to smile just the slightest bit at the little gifts he had brought. The thought made Aizawa relax, thinking that perhaps Todoroki would enjoy something his class put effort into making him. Aizawa had agreed to bring the basket to him tonight, so that the fresh cheese Aoyama wanted to cut wouldn't go bad, and so the others currently out on their work studies could participate as well. Aizawa watched them work, conceding to giving his students advice about what they were putting in. They all seemed self-conscious about what to give to Todoroki, and just wanted someone to put their minds at ease. Uraraka and Azui had returned from their work studies a couple hours after lunch. Just before dinner was scheduled to start being made, Bakugo and Midoriya returned, both of them scraped up. Nonetheless, Midoriya had seemed freshly energized at the prospect of the gift basket, and scarfed down his meal quickly to be able to formulate his own idea of what to give him. Aizawa tried to keep his face as straight as possible as Bakugo kept loudly shouting about what a stupid idea it was, but still put something in for Todoroki. He was glad that he could rely on his class to do everything in their power to make Todoroki feel better. It couldn't have been easy on them to constantly be denied the ability to see Todoroki, but they were keeping their upbeat attitudes and their smiles as they finished wrapping the basket and handing it off to Aizawa. Yaoyorozu stepped forward, her hands folded in front of her in a pleading gesture. "Will you tell us what he thinks?" Aizawa nodded, tucking the basket under his arm as he opened the door to the dorm building. "I'll make sure to let him know that you're all thinking about him. I'm sure he'll appreciate it." He heard several sighs of relief, and caught a couple shoulders slumping out of the corner of his eye. It would seem his class was wound as tightly as he was. He went ahead and texted Hisashi that he'd be borrowing his car as soon as he had strapped the basket in. He knew his husband wouldn't mind, but he still wanted to make sure he let him know, in case he went looking for him or the car later. Now, Aizawa sighed, dialing Hawk's number as he began to steer the car out towards the exit. "I hope they're both still alive." Midoriya only felt himself relax after he watched Mr. Aizawa's, technically present mix, car drive away from his balcony. He had been worried about his teacher possibly being followed by someone working for Endeavor, no matter how ridiculous the thought was. He refused to put it past the number one hero, especially after how he had been behaving during the work study today. Midoriya knew Endeavor wasn't stupid. He could probably figure out that Todoroki's class knew everything that was going on right now. That had probably been the reason why Endeavor was acting so stiff, on edge. He was probably concerned that either Midoriya or Kaken would try something, considering they were both really close to Todoroki. Still, Kaken had actually been the one to approach Midoriya and demand that they discuss what actions to take regarding Endeavor. And though neither of them were particularly happy about it, they both agreed that it would be too risky and foolish to try anything against him by themselves. They knew that the pros working on the case were trying to build up solid evidence, and they didn't want to screw that up by attacking Endeavor and painting him as a victim. Midoriya was proud of Kaken for being able to not blow the man's face off, and was ever more impressed with his own ability to restrain himself, when all he had been able to think about when out on patrol was how nice it would feel to one-for-all shoot-style kick Endeavor right in the face. Midoriya hoped that Todoroki liked what they had all sent him. He tried to write a really rushed letter to make Todoroki feel better, but he didn't know how well it had turned out in the end. "Oh, I hope he doesn't read it. But of course he will, because Todoroki is kind and respectful." Midoriya knew this. If someone sent him a letter, no matter how horrible, he would read it word for word. It just made Midoriya angrier that someone so kind had been repeatedly treated so horribly, by his own father no less. Midoriya really just needed to let off some steam. He thought about going for a run, but UA's curfew was strict, especially now. Instead he decided that he should go hit something in the school's gym. And what better thing to hit than Kaken? Surely he'd be just as upset, though he'd never admit it. Kaken loved letting off steam by beating the living daylights out of people, especially if that someone is Midoriya. Of course, they'd had to ask a teacher to supervise their training session, and since Aizawa was gone, they'd both had to wait for half an hour until a teacher had finished up their work to go watch them. No words had been exchanged between them the whole time they were waiting out in the hallway, but it was no longer a charged, uncomfortable silence like it always used to be. Thank all might that Kaken and I made up. Midoriya let out a silent sigh of relief. Otherwise, I wouldn't have someone to train with. And Kaken would still absolutely hate me. I'd never trust him to train with. Finally, Vlad King said that he could supervise their training session, but a couple of his students were going to tag along. Fine by me. So long as I can get my mind off of everything. And the next thing Midoriya knew, he and Kaken were sparring like their lives depended on it. Midoriya tried to keep from imagining Kaken as Endeavor, that most certainly wouldn't be getting his mind off of it, and it would only really be an insult to Kaken. Besides, he didn't want to combat violence with more violence. Endeavor should be brought to justice the right way. The legal way. Even though every fiber in Midoriya's body was telling him that now is a great time to visualize Endeavor right as he landed a solid kick to Kaken's side, luckily only using 8% of one for all. He landed on the ground, a little unsteady as sweat ran down his face. He was exhausted from the last hour of training, but couldn't make himself stop. He needed more. He needed to, but Midoriya's head snapped up, fixating on Vlad King, sitting beside Monoma and Tetsu, all three looking a bit nervous. How about you boys take to the showers, Vlad chuckled, though it seemed a bit forced. Before both of you end up killing each other. Midoriya glanced over at Kaken, who was glaring at them, but he was heaving as well, wiping sweat away from his brow every other breath. Maybe it was time to take a break. This could very well be continued on Monday in hero training. Midoriya nodded, knowing that Kaken had come to the same conclusion. Midoriya grabbed his towel and water bottle, marching past the others to hustle back and take a shower. Now that he wasn't moving, he felt exactly how sticky and gross he truly was. Vlad and his students shied just a little bit away from him and Kaken as they both walked past, watching them with skepticism. Midoriya wanted to assure them that there was nothing to fear, this was just training after all. They didn't actually want to hurt anyone. But Midoriya was no liar. He didn't want to hurt Kaken, but he was still fuming with anger. Even though his muscles were sore and his body was exhausted, he still wasn't sure he'd gotten rid of all of his extra energy. Well, maybe he could just sleep it off. He had canceled his visit with his mom this weekend because of his work-study scheduled this morning, so he could sleep in as long as he wanted without having to worry. Well, he didn't have to worry about keeping his mom waiting. But there were plenty of other things to worry about. Things that Midoriya just could not stop thinking about, no matter how hard he tried, how much he fought, how fast he moved. He wanted to be there for Todoroki. Writing a letter wasn't the same as being able to wrap his arms around his friend and hold him. Above all, he figured that Todoroki just wanted someone to be there for him. I'm here. Midoriya wanted to be able to tell him, I am here for you. Hawks felt like he was walking on eggshells around Todoroki. The kid hadn't said anything since he'd arrived. His expression hadn't changed, he hadn't given away anything that he might be thinking. Hawks couldn't get a read on him at all. Hawks had never had a kid before. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. Should they eat meals together at a table? Or would Todoroki prefer to eat alone? He wanted to give the kid privacy, but he couldn't afford to just leave him alone without anyone watching his actions. Hawks had a couple trusted agents from his agency who would stay here with the kid when he needed to go out on hero business, and a therapist would be visiting every day. Hawks had been asked to basically make himself scarce whenever the therapist was there. Hawks didn't need to worry about having to watch the kid at all times. Still, he was fidgety, mostly regarding the whole situation outside of just Todoroki's own actions. Would Endeavor think to check here? Hawks' penthouse apartment had tall windows with no curtains, so would Endeavor be able to see through them if he floated up this far? At least his apartment was big enough for 2 people. He had a guest room that's been unused since he moved in. He'd been bored and had decorated it to be a resort-worthy room, certainly something Todoroki should be used to after growing up with Endeavor. But still, was the kid comfortable? Hawks had been to Endeavor's house before. It was all Japanese style, made out of wood. Would the modern setting make Todoroki uncomfortable? Would he hate it? Would the entire arrangement disorient him? Hawks wished his brain would just shut up. After all, his biggest worry was one that would not text him back. He had messaged the League as soon as he'd been asked to take on the assignment of being Todoroki's caretaker until the whole ordeal was through. That way, the League would know to not make any unscheduled stops by his place. And yes, that did happen. It was never too often. The League of Villains didn't like to be predictable in that way, but occasionally Toga or Twice would come by, sometimes bringing another member with them. Most of the time Hawks didn't mind. He lived alone, and never let anyone in without permission. The League always seemed to know when Hawks had people over. They were no doubt keeping tabs on him, and avoided making visits when there were others around. But the League had been explicitly interested in Todoroki. Hawks guessed they had a soft spot for kids who hate heroes, even if that hero is just the kid's father, and they had already made one reckless visit to see him in the hospital. Hawks didn't want to take his chances and have a League member show up when the kid was here to see them and probably give Hawks away. But every member of the League of Villains seemed to decide that his message wasn't worth responding to. He received no clarification that they would stay away. And while he was certain they wouldn't make themselves known while members of Hawk's agency or the therapist were here, he wasn't certain that they wouldn't deliberately check in on the kid. And Aizawa would be here in less than an hour, apparently bringing a gift basket from the kid's class or something. Please, don't do anything stupid. He tossed his phone on his bed and walked out of his bedroom, closing the door behind him. Todoroki seemed to have a wandering problem. He didn't open any doors that were shut, but he seemed to be curious in his own way. Hawks found the kid curled up in a blanket in front of the TV screen, though he hadn't put anything on. The screen was all fuzzy and painful to look at, but Todoroki seemed to have zoned out a long time ago. Hawks went over and picked up the remote, turning the TV off to get the static off of the screen. Don't hurt your eyes, kid. He smiled at Todoroki, who blinked as if he hadn't realized he'd zoned out. Hawks set the remote down next to Todoroki as he went to check on dinner. He'd called and asked Aizawa what the kid generally liked to eat, and had somehow ended up learning how to make cold soba. Aizawa had made sure that Hawks knew that Todoroki liked his soba in varying degrees of cold depending on his mood. The more upset he was, the colder he preferred his soba to be. Probably because it would be the farthest thing from Endeavor, and Hawks really didn't want the kid to have to be reminded of him right now, so he'd stuck the soba in the fridge so it could get extra cold. He grabbed it from the fridge and dished it out into a bowl, making sure to grab the right sauce and a pair of chopsticks as he left the kitchen. Todoroki saw him coming before he'd even made it 6 feet away from him. The kid eyed him warily, watching his every step as he came closer before he handed him his meal. I know you might not be very hungry, Hawks shrugged, holding out the chopsticks for him to take next. But you should eat. I hope I made it right. At the very least, it shouldn't make you gag. Todoroki didn't laugh. Hawks hadn't expected him to, but he did concede to taking the chopsticks and breaking them apart. Hawks smiled, grabbing the remote again and turning the TV on, pressing a random button to give Todoroki something to do while he ate. Pro-hero Endeavor won't divulge the details of his son's hospitalization. All we know is that they have revoked his access to the room and are refusing to let him see Dash. Hawks immediately turned the screen off again, smiling sheepishly at Todoroki, who just looked up at him blankly. Well, that immediately backfired. Hawks chuckled nervously. Is there any channel you usually like to watch? Todoroki shook his head. He didn't ever let me watch anything. Hawks ignored the needle that went through his heart at that statement, instead turning the TV back on and quickly switching to a channel he'd heard played good movies for kids. You ever watch this? I'm sure it's good. Hawks tossed the remote down onto the couch again, waving off the questioning look in Todoroki's eyes as his ear caught on the sound of his phone going off in his bedroom. You enjoy that and I'll be right back. He dashed back to his room, just barely catching the call before it went to voicemail. It's Aizawa. I'm down in the lobby. Could you buzz me up? Oh yeah, of course. Hawks chuckled. Right away. See you in a minute. He hung up the call and left his room again, heading over to the door to his apartment so that he could let Aizawa up. Hopefully, with his teacher here, Todoroki would be a little less inclined to stare directly at Hawks every time he so much as entered the room. Shudo was glad that Aizawa had come. He had nothing against Hawks, but he was almost certain the man had never met a kid in his life. Either Hawks must not be very good at telling ages, or Shudo was more out of the loop than he thought. He would never have considered watching an animated movie that was centered around relentless optimism and beating the not-even-that-bad guy with the power of friendship. The soba was good though, and extremely cold. And that was always a start. Aizawa had explained that he couldn't stay long, he and Hawks whispering in hushed tones in the corner as Shudo went through the gift basket he'd been brought. He could tell most of who had given him what. The cheese was definitely Aoyama, the obscene magazine was most definitely Mineta, the stack of books could have either been Ida or Yaoyorozu. The Chibi All Might keychain was almost certainly Midoriya, though his came with a letter attached. Hey, Todoroki-kun. I hope you're feeling better, and I'm glad that you were let out of the hospital. I know that we don't know where you are, which is probably a good thing, but I want to let you know that no matter where you are, I am here for you, Todoroki. I'll always be here for you, whenever you need me. I know that you're struggling, and I can't begin to understand everything that's going on, but I hope you find that I can be someone you trust. And I'm here to save you, should you need me to. All of our classes, in fact. Please, take all the time you need to recover. I know you, and I know that you like to say that you're fine even when you're not. If your head is telling you that, then maybe listen to your body or heart or something. Wow, this got really cheesy really fast. Lima would be jealous. Still, we'll be waiting for you when you come back. Get ready to receive lots of hugs and affection because I'm never letting you go unappreciated ever again. Midoriya, and Class 1A. Shudo read over the words over and over again until he felt like his mind was going numb. Thank you, Midoriya. You have no idea how much. He blinked, his eyes feeling unmistakably wet. No, that wasn't right. Shudo hadn't cried in a long time. He no longer cried during panic attacks, no longer cried from guilt at hurting himself, no longer cried when Endeavor beat him into a pulp. He didn't cry. Not from pain, not from words, not from anything. And he wasn't crying now. But his eyes seemed to think that they should, after so long. Shudo harshly blinked the wetness away. The last time he had cried, he'd ended up swallowing a bunch of pills, slicing his skin open, and attempting to jump off of a roof. That kind of weakness could not happen again, nor would any like it. Weakness could not befall Shudo. Not now. Still, he made sure the letter didn't wrinkle even slightly as he laid it on top of the rest of what was in the basket. He took a few calming breaths to steady himself from what could have very well been a disaster. He continued to focus on his breathing until he was sure that no tears would form, that no panic would spike and cause him to spiral. He kept focus on the conversation across the room, just to make sure they weren't watching him calm himself down. Shudo finished the last of his soba in peace, accepting a few final words of encouragement from Aizawa before he left to return to UA. Oh, how Shudo wished he could just erase all of the past week and pretend like none of it had happened. To wake up and have it be just a normal day for his class at UA, whether that be a villain attack or boring lecture. He'd take anything over how isolated he was now. Hell, he'd go back to Endeavor if it meant he could pretend like everything was back to the way it was. He had been so foolish then, to try something so reckless and stupid. Honestly, did these people think they stood a chance at winning a case over Endeavor? Shudo wanted to have faith in them, allow himself to believe that they could pull it off. But Shudo didn't want to get hurt again when it inevitably failed. The last time someone had rebelled against Endeavor, it had been his older brother, who had thoroughly suffered for that, died even. And before that, it had been her, who was then beaten every day to the point of insanity, and shipped away like a problem he couldn't be bothered to solve. Shudo didn't want to end up like either of them. Back then, he had been foolish, and had tried to create his own escape route. And in seeking to be like his older brother, dying by his own hand, he had instead become like her, isolated and deemed mentally incapable of being alone. If either option was the worst-case scenario, the stuff of his nightmares, then how could Shudo ever hope to win?